So hello, everybody, and welcome to day 2 of the Neurodiversity and Trauma Conference by the Neurodiversity Collective, which consists of a group of people. I wanted to just first give you the content warning to make sure that you all are aware that some of the presentations includes references to trauma, neurodiversity, and personal experiences that some may find emotionally challenging. Please do take care of yourself throughout. Feel free to pause, step away, seek support in whichever way feels right for you. So a very warm welcome to all of you for day 2 of our 2-day conference on neurodiversity and trauma. I'm Charlotte Valeur, the CEO and founder of the Institute of Neurodiversity. This 2-day conference has been organized by the Iron Research and Professional Development Unit, also called the Neurodiversity Collective, which is consisting of University College Dublin, Maynooth University, ADHD Ireland, Neurodiversity Hub Australia, and Iron Global. We are very honored to have you all with us, whether you're joining us as speakers, participant, professional, lived experience advocate, researcher, or someone still exploring what neurodiversity means in the context of trauma and healing. Yesterday, we saw presentations on childhood trauma and how it could develop comparisons between neurotype traits and trauma symptoms and some trauma lived experiences. We discussed some changes for the future. We'll do that again today. Some of the things that came up yesterday for changes for the future was increased awareness and acceptance, more neuroaffirmative training, especially of therapists, needs-based, not labels-based training specifically, and then some services flexibility. We also discussed, for example, with diagnostics, whether we should ensure that the strengths of certain neurotypes will come into diagnostics and not just the weaknesses. That could be a more efficient way potentially to separate trauma and neurodiversity. So our last speaker today is unfortunately ill and have had to say that she can't be here. We wish her a speedy recovery. And hope that she won't feel ill for too long. Over today, we'll be hearing from a range of voices. Some are experts in their fields, others are experts in their own lives. Together, we'll be reflecting on what happens when systems misunderstand minorities and how those experiences can leave deep marks on the body, mind, and sense of self. We ask that everyone in this space treats each other with dignity, sensitivity, respect, and care. These are topics that can be both enlightening and activating. We recognize that some conversations may bring up emotions or memories, and we encourage you to look after yourself throughout. Take breaks as needed or move away from the screen. Also, model safety and respect. A few quick notes about how the event will run. There'll be no open chat function during the sessions. This is to reduce overwhelm and distraction. We'll have a Q&A function available during presentations. Please feel free to post your questions there throughout, and our moderators will ensure that we'll pass them on to the speakers. Captioning is available, and all sessions are being recorded for those who have requested access later. So thank you again for being here. Let's begin this important work with open minds, grounded presence, and care for one another. And I will now like to welcome our first speaker. And just read out the bio. Dr. Emma Taylor, welcome to speak here. You are going to talk about attachment and interpersonal trauma among autistic adults. Dr. Emma Taylor is a clinical psychologist with over 20 years of experience working with neurodivergent adults and children in clinical, diagnostic, and academic contexts. She works therapeutically with adults of all ages, genders, and neurotypes, as well as carrying out formal diagnostic assessments for autism and ADHD, and providing supervision to other therapies. Her main approaches are based in acceptance and commitment therapy, attachment, and mindfulness. Welcome today, Emma. I will go off screen so that you will have the space yourself.
Thank you so much. I hope everyone can hear me okay, but please do let me know, put a note in the Q&A if you're having any difficulties with the connection or the audio. And I'm delighted to be here. And yes, as Charlotte says, I'm going to talk about attachment and interpersonal, attachment trauma and interpersonal trauma, and how it specifically affects um, autistic people. And I have a little note on why it says autistic people rather than neurodivergent people, given the topic of the conference, but I'll come to that. So I'm going to start by just talking briefly about attachment. What do I mean? What are the key concepts that we need to grasp? It's a vast topic, but just a few key things that we all need to be holding in mind when we're talking about attachment. What do we know about attachment in neurodivergent people, children and adults? And then thinking specifically about neurodivergent people's experiences of attachment trauma and of interpersonal trauma, and the implications of that for clinicians and also for neurodivergent people who are accessing clinical services, the way they might get met by people in a diagnostic role or in a therapeutic role. And I want to start before launching into anything by being really explicit that I'm here as a neurodivergent person myself, as well as somebody who works clinically and diagnostically with neurodivergent people, that I'm here taking an explicitly neuroaffirmative position, that I recognize the importance of self-identification and the inaccessibility very often of formal diagnosis, but the value of that nonetheless for some people who are able to access that, and the inequality of access that different people have to that. I'll expand on that in the questions if anyone's interested, but I just wanted to start explicitly from that position. So thinking about attachment, when we talk about the idea of attachment relationships, attachment theory, there's a few key concepts that I want to make sure I've kind of stuck up on the pinboard behind us in order to enable us to have a conversation about neurodivergent attachment and what the key issues are, what the differences are from what might be expected by other people, what patterns we might see. And an attachment relationship is essentially a relationship in which we can feel safe and loved. And that's dependent on feeling accurately held in mind by another person, consistently remembered by another person. I need to know that if a person who is taking care of me isn't in the same room as me, they remember I exist. They know what my needs are. They understand me. They will know what I need and help me to have those needs met. And this is a task for a parent, but the consequences of how a parent carries that out for a young child, we see the consequences in the child. And so attachment, when we assess attachment, when we talk about attachment status, we tend to talk about the person who experienced or didn't experience feeling safe and loved, being accurately held in mind. But that status, that attachment status in any individual person is a reflection of how they were held or not held in mind, made to feel safe, made to feel loved by the attachment figures in their life. And in childhood, when we talk about attachment, it's easier to understand what we mean when we're thinking about, say, a baby, a toddler, which is where we first kind of see the behavioral manifestations of attachment. In childhood, the child's attempts to seek attachment and the child's attachment relationship, these are really the child's predictions about how specific important people in their lives will behave. So if I cry, will I be looked after or ignored or shouted at? If I am hurt, who should I go to? What will happen? If something happens to me, will I be looked after? If someone goes away, can I depend on them coming back? It's really accurate, information-based predictions about the people who are in your life whose job it is to take care of you. And therefore, when we're looking at children's attachment, the very young children, the kind of toddlers and early school-age children, we can only really look at that through behavior. And so when we talk about childhood attachment patterns, we're talking for specific people, although we'll generally people will kind of shorthand talk about one attachment type for a child, because you may be thinking about one key attachment figure. Children can have different attachment styles for different people in their lives. You may have one person who is, you can feel secure, you know that they will look after you, and another person who's quite frightening or quite unreliable, and you'll have different patterns for those things. And those are really useful problem-solving predictions about your environment. How do I get my needs met? Who do I go to? What kind of behavior from me gets the best reaction from them? And so we look at that in a child's behavior, but we're looking at the child's behavior because we believe it reflects their expectations about how they will be looked after. What the model of attachment theory suggests is that throughout later childhood and into adulthood, those specific predictions about particular people become a more generalized, what we'd call an internal working model of a general sense of, in general, people will treat me like this. I can expect these things to happen to me. If I do this, then generally that will happen. And those sort of act as our defaults when we don't know how someone's going to behave, but they also shape the ways our relationships play out and who we feel comfortable with and what kinds of behavior are a good fit with us, which ways we expect to be treated. And so by adulthood, we're talking about a single state of mind with respect to attachment, a single kind of umbrella term. And it's not a prediction, is not a description of how people treated you in childhood. It's how you have come to think about these things. And one of the really important things is you can be not well cared for in childhood, but by adulthood, come to have a kind of steady, settled, comfortable state of mind with respect to that. We call it earned security. You can come to feeling safe around attachments, even if your own early experiences have been bad. Whereas childhood, if your experiences are bad, you've learnt, don't rely on these people, they're not going to look after you. It's different in adulthood. And in an adult attachment assessment would almost always be through some form of conversation, generally an adult attachment interview, there's other forms, but through how do you talk about attachment? How do you reflect on your experiences? What sense do you make of them? What are your own kind of internalized kind of predictions and templates and scripts about attachment relationships? And I mention that here because that's quite important when we get to thinking about how that might show up differently among neurodivergent people. You can look at attachment in these categorical ways. It's a bit confusing because the terminology for children and adults is slightly different, but essentially you can put people in categories of you have a secure attachment, essentially meaning in childhood, the people you expect to look after you. You go to seek security and you get it. Again, it's your categorization, but it's about other people's behavior, or other people meeting your needs. You can be put into the avoidant category. So that's suppressing emotions, suppressing attachment needs, not asking for comfort. Or ambivalent, which is a state that reflects more kind of wanting that comfort and seeking it, but it being kind of inconsistent. So maybe you have to kind of ramp up your expression of distress in order to get a reaction. Maybe some of the time you get a reaction, some of the time you don't. But you're still trying in various different ways. And those will play out different ways in children and in adults. But this is not the time to, this is a particular interest of mine, so I could talk for days about this, but I'm just kind of sticking a pin in the important concepts. Other researchers use dimensional concepts of attachment. So rather than saying, which of these boxes do you belong in? We can say, well, some people are more or less anxious within attachment relationships. Do I feel confident that this person I love loves me back, will come back if they leave, that they can be relied on? And you could go dimensional, you could go anywhere along that dimension, but then you can have another dimension of avoidance. How much do I acknowledge my own needs versus try and suppress them and try and be kind of entirely independent? And you can plot anyone on those kind of 2 points in the scale and put everyone into a kind of 2-dimensional space. In addition to these kind of either categories or dimensions, there is another category, which is disorganized attachment. And that's a specific category for people who have experienced attachment trauma. So where the attachment relationships that should be a source of security and safety are a source of threat, potential harm. And so if, for example, you're a small child and your parent is very frightening in some way, if they do something that is really overwhelming and frightening to you, maybe they're yelling and screaming, maybe they're physically hurting you, maybe they are personally, emotionally overwhelmed and you don't know what's going on with them, you feel frightened. and you want to run away from them because they're frightening, and you want to run towards your source of comfort, which is that same person. And so you get this, what we'd call an approach avoidance conflict, where the very person that is frightening to you is also the person you want to go to for comfort because you're frightened. And I will return to this, but when we're looking at that behaviorally, what we might see in a child with a disorganized attachment is referred to in it's spelled out in a lot more detail, but essentially it comes under the heading of bizarre behavior, behavior that doesn't make sense. When we're looking at adulthood, we're listening to adults speak about their attachment experiences. We talk about lapses of coherence. So people who, when they're asked about specific attachment relationships, lose their kind of speech coherence. They start to talk about someone in the present tense who's been dead for a long while. They lose the ability to tell a coherent story. Perhaps it's already occurring to you why these things are an issue when we're thinking about assessing neurodivergent attachment, but I will come back to that explicitly later on. So, thinking about neurodivergent attachment, I would love to give a talk about neurodivergent attachment, but I am more or less forced to give a talk about autistic attachment because mainly because of what research exists, that thinking about ADHD, for example, and other forms of neurodivergence, the evidence base just is not there. There's been a lot more research. The vast majority of the research with any kind of neurodivergent people and attachment, it's with autistic children largely, a very small amount with adults, but largely autistic children. That is the body of research that exists. There's a little bit around parenting children with ADHD, but essentially the research is about autistic attachment. So I've tried to kind of title the talk to reflect that, because I can't give you statistics around ADHD attachment patterns because the evidence just isn't great. The other thing, though, and it's sort of a central part of my practice, is that what we know now that the diagnostic criteria will allow us to diagnose both autism and ADHD in the same person, which wasn't possible 12 years ago, but now it has become possible, and we're beginning to understand how those two things present together. We know that people with any form of neurodivergence are more likely to have other forms of neurodivergence, and specifically that if you take someone who has an ADHD diagnosis and you do a formal autism assessment, somewhere between 30 to 70% of those people will meet criteria for autism. And the same if you take a person with an autism diagnosis and you do an ADHD assessment. Not very many of those people are already identified, but what we know is if I'm talking about autistic people, I'm talking about quite a lot of people with ADHD and other neurodivergences as well. And we also know, and I think there's a kind of slowly shifting conceptualization of what we mean by neurodivergence and the overlapping experiences, where as we're hearing more directly from neurodivergent people rather than from a kind of distant observer with a clipboard, as most of the kind of historically, most of the research, most of the clinical writing and thinking and training, and certainly the diagnostic criteria have been. Now we're hearing more from people with ADHD, for example, about their experiences of social communication. We're hearing from autistic people about their executive functioning and memory and focus issues, and it's not clear how much of that is people with dual diagnoses that aren't identified, or how much of that is there are these overlaps within neurodivergence that aren't currently well mapped out. All of which is to say, I am largely talking, where I'm talking about research evidence, I'm largely talking specifically about autistic people, but I do believe there's quite a lot of overlap in a lot of the things I'm going to talk about. So sometimes my language is going to get muddled, and apologies for that. I'll try and be specific about whether I mean just autistic people or whether I mean neurodivergent people more generally. But a lot of the time the lines are blurred in thinking and talking about this. So what do we know about attachment and autism? The very earliest theories about autism were that it's a failure of attachment, that you have these cold refrigerator mothers who don't love their children enough, and therefore the child cannot form a relationship because they're not properly loved. I hope I don't explicitly need to say, but just in case, there is no basis for this. There is absolutely no basis for this. We know a lot of mothers of autistic children are themselves neurodivergent and probably being read by clinicians as a little bit odd and a little bit different, and finding it really easy to write those mothers off. I will talk more about the experience of parenting neurodivergent children, but although this is kind of, in theory, blown out of the water decades since, it still shows up. It was still really implicit and kind of explicit in some of the diagnostic criteria kind of 20, 30 years ago, talking about children, autistic children mechanically clinging to people without, indifferent to who they were, and this sense of kind of autism is a lack of attachment. And that's just not the case. And there's not evidence for it, but it's still reflected in some of the prejudices and some of the stereotypes that people have. A lot of the early research was with autistic children who also had developmental delays, and because of autism not being diagnosed and identified until children were 4 or 5 years old, if not older, they were then doing the strange situation, which is a really good measure of attachment in toddlers who've just learnt to walk and just acquired the ability to run away from their parents. And it's really interesting to know, how will they manage that? Will they come back? That's a real key moment in a child's attachment history, is that kind of 18 months to 2.5, say. But then they were taking 5, 6, 7, 8-year-olds, autistic children, and putting them in that research paradigm. And obviously you're going to see different things. And because of the bias towards the assumption until not very long ago that the majority of autistic children also had developmental delays, that meant that most of the early research was done with children who were also developmentally delayed, had language delay. And so we're seeing very different things. It was just a mismatch of what the assessment tools were designed to do and the children who we were looking at. It's been a recurring issue about how to distinguish disorganized attachment from autistic behavior. If you read the descriptions of what you might see as disorganized attachment markers in the strange situation, you might see children rocking, flapping, screaming, turning their back on a parent, turning around and approaching a parent backwards to be hugged, so freezing, not knowing what to do, doing things that don't make sense to the person watching. A lot of this is really hard to distinguish to somebody who's not familiar with the normal behavior of neurodivergent toddlers. This could be a child who's absolutely thriving and having a lovely time and has got a parent who's perfectly well meeting all of their needs. And it's taken some time for researchers to really be able to say, how can we say all of these things are not typical for neurotypical toddlers, but they're perfectly ordinary. They don't have an attachment meaning when we see autistic toddlers doing these things. What, in addition, would we need to see to say this child has a disorganized attachment? What we know is that children who have autism and a developmental delay do seem to have lower rates of attachment security. But those who don't have a developmental delay seem to have the same rates of attachment security as other children. So this led some people to think, are autistic children doing something different to form their attachments? Are they having to use their brains in some way to form their attachments rather than it being this sort of felt sense? And there's this idea of, well, maybe they're not emotionally attuned to other people, but they can cognitively attune. They can make these accurate predictions. But I think we also need to think about parenting and what we know around parenting stress, for example, and how hard many parents find it to tune into the needs, the communication, the expressions of their neurodivergent young children, particularly where there is developmental delay, particularly where there's quite intense needs. And you have parents who are often really not well supported, really tired, really battling with multiple systems simultaneously, medical systems and educational systems and social services and all sorts of other things. Those parents are not in the best state to meet those child's needs consistently and responsively. They maybe don't have the resources. They're just not in a good way. They're not well looked after themselves. They are not being helped to understand their child's needs. So it's not clear exactly where the explanations lie, and it could be a combination of all of these things. I wrote my thesis on attachment in autistic adults. I handed it in when I was doing the adult attachment interview with autistic adults, and I was terrified all the time I was writing it up that before I managed to submit my thesis, someone else would do this thing that hadn't been done before, and then my whole thesis was out the window. I submitted it 19 years ago, and I'm still waiting for someone else to do it. There's not a lot of an interest in attachment in autistic adults, and I don't know why. I'm interested in it. But what I found in doing my thesis is that it's possible for autistic adults to have a secure attachment, but it's at much lower rates than among autistic children. It's sort of comparable to the rates you might see if you look at any sample of people with psychological health problems, people with long-standing and complex anxiety, depression, these kind of things. And that realistically, that is the experience for a lot of autistic adults. And overwhelmingly, the message I got was I felt loved mostly from most people, but I didn't feel understood. Sometimes I felt loved, but I didn't feel liked. And sometimes I felt like my needs would be met if they could get what they were. There's some research on autistic adults in romantic relationships, and generally finding that more avoidant attachment traits show up in romantic relationships. I won't go into that because that's outside of my kind of particular area of interest, but just flagging that up. So I wanted to think about when a neurodivergent person is experiencing attachment, when they are looking to another person for security, we need to bear in mind that as a neurodivergent system, you know, I think sometimes when we look at the word neurodivergent, we think about neuro meaning brain. But let's really hold in mind, as several people said yesterday, we're talking about whole nervous systems. We're talking about brains and bodies of neurodivergent people that function differently from neurotypical people. We're talking about differences in physiological experience. We know that neurodivergent people have more kind of spikes of kind of activity in their nervous systems, that it's harder to regulate down, that we have more kind of range and more difficulty in calming down physiologically. We know that neurodivergent people experience and express emotions differently from neurotypical people. And that attachment relationship, the expression of emotion, the parent's ability to look at their child and read and label their child's emotion, really important element of that. And then for the parent to respond appropriately to the emotion that they are perceiving their child to have. And if their child doesn't express their emotions in the way that maybe that parent's other children do, or maybe that they're told to expect, they're going to get a different response. And that kind of leads into thinking about social communication. If we're thinking about a neurotypical parent, you can think about the double empathy problem in this relationship, or thinking about, as one of the speakers were talking about yesterday, about the experience of attunement. And that's both emotional, kind of physiological attunement, but also cognitive attunement, understanding, getting a sense of who this person is, what they're thinking right now, what their motivation was for the thing they just did, how they feel about me, whether they know how I feel about them. If we're thinking of a neurotypical parent and a neurodivergent child, there can be this double empathy problem between parent and child, which is a relationship where the child really needs to be able to be understood, accurately perceived, accurately held in mind, have their needs accepted, recognized, and responded to. You can also think about sensory preferences. You know, that child who's backing towards a parent for comfort. Well, neurodivergent children may have really strong sensory preferences for the ways that they are held or touched or comforted. They could be really distressed by sensory sensitivities that a parent or any other important adult isn't even aware is there. The smell that the person can't smell, a sound that the parent can't hear, a texture that's bothering them. Differences in verbal communication. And we know that for neurodivergent people, anything from never speaking, never using verbal language, through situational non-speaking, through idiosyncratic forms of communication, through occasional kind of losses of communication entirely. All sorts of differences in communication are possible. And what you see a person doing, we know that neurodivergent people look different. We know we can show tiny video clips to neurotypical people, and neurodivergent people look different even if they can't quite pin down what it is. Also, just holding in mind the changing nature of the task from childhood to adulthood, from behave appropriately to get the right reaction out of this parent, to talk about and reflect on your experiences, and the role of trauma. So I'm going to talk for a few minutes about trauma. And just to be clear, trauma, as people have said yesterday, it's not what happens to you, but it's what happens in you as a consequence of those things that happen. And it's about how the memories of that experience are stored in your mind and in your body in ways that are kind of well integrated and become kind of time marked and so on, or whether they're in ways that are kind of prone to be activated at inappropriate moments, whether that's cognitive memories or whether that's the bodily reaction that's related to those traumatizing experiences. And we talk about big T trauma being those big events where if I saw video footage of something happening to someone, I would say, wow, they must have been traumatized by that. The car crashes, the assaults, the big T traumas. But we also talk about the little T traumas, the small but constant things that set our emotional thermostats at a place of never really feeling safe. And so that's childhood abuse, neglect, that can be emotional abuse, that can be an experience of misattunement, of never really being understood, never really having your needs met, anything that is a kind of cumulative, complex, chronic trauma of never really being safe, never really being able to relax down into that place of safety. And there are differences in what is traumatizing for neurodivergent people. You could see a neurodivergent person experiencing something that is traumatizing them and have no idea that it's happening right in front of you. Because we can think about sensory trauma, we can think about this very reactive nervous system. Something can be happening to someone that looks like no big deal, but what happens in the person as a consequence can result in it being held in the mind and or body as in the ways that trauma are held. So when we're talking about attachment trauma, we're going back to this idea of the attachment relationship that should be a source of comfort is a source of fear. And let's think about some of the things that happen to neurodivergent people. You may have parents who don't understand, and that's particularly if you have neurotypical parents or parents who are overwhelmed by the task of making sense of a child who's very different from them, who has very complex needs, who's very different from what they were expecting from their child. You can have parents who do understand, whether neurodivergent or neurotypical parents, but don't know how to respond to a child who, because they have difficulties in communication, because there's a mismatch between what the parent thinks they ought to do and what they're being told by outsiders they ought to do, because there's disagreement between parents, because the parents are really struggling. We know that normal experiences, and that can include separation experiences, that look quite run-of-the-mill, and that neurotypical children have the capacity to absorb a certain amount of that kind of stress, but they can be traumatizing to a neurodivergent child. Very commonly, we're coming to realize that many neurodivergent children have neurodivergent parents who are, as we know, far more likely to be struggling with their own mental health, to be socially marginalized and disadvantaged in all sorts of ways, more likely to be in poverty, less likely to be working, less likely to have social support, more likely to be overwhelmed themselves. They may or may not be diagnosed, but they're probably not being kind of well looked after, what we know about the kinds of support that are out there for neurodivergent adults. And if we think about the ACEs yesterday, if we have parents who have so many of these things going on for them, they are not in the best possible state of mind to take care of and hold in mind their child who potentially has complex needs. And what we then see in children is attachment trauma, and in adults is attachment trauma. I'm going to skim over that because I'm aware of the time, but essentially that this can show up as avoidant or anxious attachment and as attachment disorganization. Interpersonal trauma is slightly different from attachment trauma because it doesn't have to be an attachment figure, but that another person, whether that's a stranger or whether that's typically a relationship with another person, is the source of fear. Again, we know that because of our neurodivergence, neurodivergent people are more likely to experience social isolation, ostracization. We know we're more likely to be bullied and victimized, everything from childhood, even within the family, all the way through into adulthood, into the workplace. Many neurodivergent people have complex physical health needs, and there's complex interactions with the ways people are received and looked after by mental health services, physical health services. Neurodivergent people are more likely to be sexually and physically assaulted. Again, because of the vulnerability that comes with being neurodivergent. And all of these things multiply up because we know that not having that secure attachment or not having that safety at home makes us more vulnerable to these things happening to us. And these things happening to us makes us live in the world as a traumatized person who is then in turn more vulnerable to more of these things happening for all sorts of interacting reasons. More neurodivergent people experience intimate partner violence and coercion. And again, we see this playing out in children and in adults experiencing the consequences of both small t and large t traumas in interpersonal situations, which then multiplies up with interacts with and multiplies up with some of their neurodivergent traits. So I just want to wrap up because I want to make sure I leave some space for questions. Thinking about what this means for clinicians and for neurodivergent people who are talking to clinicians. When we're thinking about diagnosis, it's not either or. You don't either have trauma or neurodivergence. And this is one of my pet peeves. It's a bigger thing than a pet peeve. I don't know what the word is, but this idea of, oh, you can't, I hear neurodivergent people saying, I was told I couldn't be neurodivergent because it was just trauma. And identifying trauma is really useful as part of a neurodivergence assessment, particularly attachment trauma, because it's a differential diagnosis. But interpersonal trauma is the neurodivergent norm. Most neurodivergent people experience interpersonal trauma. A lot of neurodivergent people experience attachment trauma. It's not a question of, is this trauma or is this neurodivergence? It's a question of, is this trauma or is this trauma and neurodivergence? Almost all of the time. And so the idea that, oh, I've found some trauma, therefore this person isn't really autistic or is not really ADHD, it doesn't make any sense. It's not a reflection of how people's lived experience really is. The diagnostic assessment should look really thoroughly at mental health and at attachment measures. There's measures that we can use as clinicians to kind of separate out and think about, well, these things that I'm looking at that you're bringing to me as I have difficulty with relating to people, or people misunderstand me, or my emotions don't match up with other people, or other people don't make sense to me. Is that happening in attachment context? Is that happening across the board? Is this a specific attachment trauma and interpersonal trauma that maps out in this particular way? Or is this fundamentally how you're wired? Was this happening before the traumas? And looking at the full picture, looking at neurodivergent people who are not, although autism is technically a social communication disorder, as problematic as that is, we know that when you listen to neurodivergent people describing our experiences, people will talk about neurodivergent joy, about sensory sensitivities and seeking and sensory delights. Where people will look at the ways that people use language. There's and meltdowns and what they look like and what they feel like, and those are different. Lots of people will come to me for assessment saying I have panic attacks, and often we can separate out those are panic attacks and these are neurodivergent meltdowns, shutdowns, procrastination, inertia, all of these things. The full picture of what it's like to be a neurodivergent person is different from the full picture of what it's like to be a traumatized neurotypical person. And I want to mention here, I talked at the beginning about one of the functions of an attachment relationship. One of the key issues to forming a secure attachment is having the experience of being accurately held in mind. And sometimes for neurodivergent people getting an accurate diagnosis in a neuroaffirmative assessment, or going to therapy with someone who understands them, or understanding themselves and being able to communicate themselves as a neurodivergent person, that can be the key that opens the door to really that person's first experiences of being accurately held in mind, because they now have a language to describe themselves to other people. In therapy, the relationship is really important, because we know that so many people have interpersonal trauma, so many people's expectations of interpersonal relationships. Neurodivergent people have experienced being mistreated a lot of the time. So the therapy relationship is really key. And having an interpersonal history or an attachment history, having a sense of what are your normal patterns, what's difficult for you. How does a therapist and a client together speak about these things, so it doesn't just play out as I feel rejected, so I'm going to back off, but no one's ever actually said the thing. Can we talk about these things? And working with rejection sensitivity, which is another concept that's risen up from within the neurodivergent community, naming these experiences that we have that are not accurately reflected in the diagnostic criteria, but which shows up all of the time. Thinking about therapy spaces and diagnostic spaces as somewhere where people can safely unmask and safely be vulnerable, where interpersonal relationships have been a place of risk and danger and a place of needing to mask and needing to self-protect. And therapists really need to be open-minded about what constitutes trauma and what might be traumatizing for a neurodivergent person. And ultimately, for me, a lot of therapy with neurodivergent people is about discovering the unmet needs, the needs that were not met in attachment relationship, and working out how to meet them in adult life. Okay, I realize we have a few minutes left, so I'm going to hand over to Charlotte, I think, who's going to put any questions.
Thank you very much. So we have a first question. I have a few ones myself, but so is there any research focusing on neurotypical children where one parent is neurodivergent?
So again, within the attachment literature, I think there's just a real gulf between people who think a lot about attachment as a theory and people who think a lot about neurodivergent people. There's not. I keep going back and looking every so often. I go and do a literature search. There's not a lot of thinking about neurodivergent people as parents.
No.
So I'd love for some people to fill in that gap, and thinking about neurodivergent parents parenting neurodivergent children, parenting neurotypical children. It would be fascinating. But to my knowledge, that if anyone knows about it, send me an email, tell me about it. I always want to know about these things.
Yeah, it's definitely an area that we need to look a lot more at. I'm from Denmark originally. My sister is a foster mother. And she said that there has been cases where a mother has had her children taken away from her because she's autistic. And I was like, yeah, okay, that doesn't sound right. You know, surely it's both, in a way, we go into long discussions, as you can imagine. Well, one thing
Oh, go ahead. Sorry. I was just going to say about I've got an interest around fabricated and induced illness allegations, because they disproportionately affect neurodivergent children, and neurodivergent parents are massively overrepresented in false accusations of fabricated illness for similar reasons. Yeah.
Another question just came in. Do you have any suggestions of how to support people specifically with rejection sensitivity?
That is a thing that I think goes beyond the scope of the next kind of couple of minutes. I think one of the things that I work as a therapist, I work from a kind of attachment focused point of view with a lot of people. And so what for me I find useful with neurodivergent people is really making the relationship explicit and starting out by mapping out what patterns do you often experience. Okay, so you often feel rejected. So chances are you're going to feel rejected by me at some point.
Yeah.
How would I know? And what might I do that would make you feel like that? And could you let me know? Could we have a different experience in therapy? And obviously outside of therapy, if you're in relationships where it's safe to do that, to have, even if it's like a particular emoji you've got agreed with a friend, where if you feel rejection sensitive, you just text them that thing and put your head down and run. And they know you feel like that, and the two of you can work together to repair that. But yeah, it's a huge topic.
Safe word or safe emoji, that's a good one. Thank you for that. So someone else is asking, I often hear parents say that because their children has experienced trauma, they will not look at possible neurodiversity. How do parents and professionals get around it? It's something we discussed yesterday as well. And it is an issue that popped up because there's such an overlap between traits and symptoms. So what would you have any thoughts of that?
Absolutely. And it's a paradox, really, because if you're kind of fishing in a pond of traumatized people, you're going to catch a lot of neurodivergent people. That's almost because the child has experienced trauma. Let's also look at neurodivergence as almost more of a marker of, well, let's be really curious about why this, because that trauma is not the events. Lots of us go through things that could be traumatizing, but this child was traumatized by the things that happened and other people are not. Let's understand this child better, their makeup, their neurotype, in order to understand this child as the full picture of their makeup.
That's a great answer. I think what we came to, and I know you watched yesterday as well, there was a lot of discussion about training therapists to actually take these kind of things into consideration, which is
absolutely
key, because I mean, from my perspective, I'm autistic and have ADHD. It's like we get sort of traumatized from cradle to grave. Remember, we come out, I have a huge sensory band with smell and touch, all kind of things. And you get handled by neurotypical carers as soon as you're born. Instantly there, your boundaries or your sensitivities are getting violated and you don't know how that's. So, thank you. Another question. Thank you so much for this. Any tips for approaching a good trauma therapist who has no training or little awareness of neurodivergence? How to ask them to acknowledge it and honor it for the therapy session? Or find a new therapist.
This is a dilemma of, do you find the neurodivergent person, the neurodivergent therapist who hopefully has some trauma experience, or do you find the trauma specialist who can come around to understand neurodivergence? There are people out there. There are neurodivergence affirming therapists. There are lots and lots of neurodivergent therapists. There are people who are able to integrate these things, and anyone who specializes in one area should have the experience in the other, because there is such a big overlap. So someone who really doesn't understand neurodivergence would kind of ring alarm bells for me as a trauma therapist, because that's going to be a significant portion of the people they work with that they risk re-traumatizing, not only not helping, but actively re-traumatizing. Or adding a new trauma.
No, absolutely. I had the experience. I was years ago going to a psychotherapist when I just started looking at maybe autistic, and I mentioned that to him, and he said, no, you're not, because my sister is in she's an institution and you're not, so that's not. And I was like, okay, thank you for that input. I have to stop going to you until I have sorted my potential neurodivergence out, and then I might come back. But that limitation without therapy instantly was a red flag for me, that if you haven't even got an inch of openness to that, just because that defenders what sits in your head, like a female Rain Man or whatever it was, then
absolutely. And we loop right back round to that experience of not being accurately held in mind, lack of attunement, invalidation, not being understood, not having your needs met. We're right back in the territory of interpersonal and attachment trauma, where a therapist needs to be an attachment figure.
Absolutely.
To some degree,
and you wouldn't be when you reject people. So so the final one for me personally, so there is a look, and this is something I just like to talk about, because people say to me, oh, you don't look autistic, when I say I'm autistic, and my answer is always, could you please talk to me about what you believe autistic looks like, and I never get an answer. So if you say there are some traits, kind of goes against what, to be honest, what I'm thinking, of course, what is it? Right? Where are the things we can see that you can say, oh, that looks autistic, that's difficult, right?
Yeah, absolutely. My facetious response, which someone suggested in a meme on social media, is if someone says you don't look autistic, lean in and ask them if you smell autistic. But that's not my professional recommendation. I think it's hard, because what we know is that, on the one hand, most of us, including lots of not yet diagnosed neurodivergent people, have stereotypes in our head of ADHD looks like a small hyperactive little white boy, autism looks like a kind of absent-minded professor, whatever it might be, and that excludes vast numbers of people of color, people with physical disabilities, women, non-binary people, all sorts of people and people with dual diagnosis as well, who don't look either of those ways. And so on the one hand, there's these very fixed, tiny little boxes of stereotypes that people think you ought to look like Otherwise, you're probably making it up. You probably just saw someone on TikTok and it felt like a good idea. But at the same time, we know that you can show neurotypical people tiny little video clips of autistic people moving around, talking to camera. And there's something about the timing of autistic people's movements, about the way we use language, of neurodivergent people more generally, the physical way we move around in space, where we very quickly move into that sort of uncanny valley. And people won't accurately perceive you as neurodivergent, but they will just not like you very much. Just default to like, oh, I don't think I want to be friends with them. And they will do that off seconds of video footage, but they won't recognize that. If it would be better if they went, oh, I think that person's neurodivergent. And I've noticed I feel a bit awkward about that. That would be better. But it's both. It's I don't know what's up with you, but I don't like it very much.
I know. That's interesting, but of course that I actually can relate to. And I've always thought this is something in the vibrations, is that when I was little, I had 3 siblings. I got bullied incessantly. I'm in the middle. And I was like, doesn't say bully me on my forehead. I don't understand why people jump on me and literally beat me, throw stink bombs at me, whatever. None of this happened to my siblings. And we never understood why. But today I'm thinking they could feel. I was almost non-speaking till I was 12. It was too dangerous to talk. So they could feel the difference. So that's what you're talking about more than
tiny differences in movements, in timing, in posture, in speech. Tiny little movements. And some of them we've got some sense of being able to measure. But we intuitively read them like that. And the same way that neurodivergent people will often have ADAR and detect each other from across a crowded room, and flock together.
Say we can try to mask, but it doesn't actually work because people figure it out. Thank you so much, Emma, for your time. Thank you so much for the questions, everyone. I will now move over to Tony Lloyd. Sorry, Tony, I just got to have your bio to read out. And of course, I've gone away from it. Here we are. Dr. Tony Lloyd is up next, going to talk about tailoring drama treatment, best practice and therapeutic considerations. Dr. Tony Lloyd is an independent consultant and has been a pioneering advocate for neurodiverse paradigm in health, education and business in the UK for over 20 years. And as the CEO of the ADHD Foundation, Neurodiversity charity from startup in 2007 to February 2025, the largest user-led ADHD neurodiversity specialist agency in Europe. Dr. Lloyd has contributed to several national reports and academic papers, including the new National Service Delivery Model for ADHD in the UK National Health Service, and produced a series of information booklets and short training films for the workforce and general public. Dr. Lloyd is the recipient of several national awards, including National Diversity Lifetime Achievement Award, the UK Top 100 LGBTQ+ Leaders 2017 to 21, the National Leaders Award for Education, most recently the UK Top 50 Inclusive Leaders. Dr. Lloyd is a psychologist with a doctorate in ADHD. He's got co-authored several national reports on neurodiversity and ADHD, and is a regular writer for mainstream and all sectors of the media. Welcome, Tony. I look forward to hearing your presentation.
Thanks very much indeed. I'm just going to share my screen. Okay, and can everybody see that okay? So first of all, thank you very much for the introduction. Thank you very much for asking me to speak. Thank you to everybody who is here on a Friday afternoon. But for those who are going to be watching this afterwards, I need to explain that some of the slides are a little text heavy, and that is so that those people who, in terms of their executive functioning, process information in multiple ways, not just visually, but in a linear and narrative form. So I hope the slides aren't too busy, but by the same token, hope that they provide useful source of processing information as well. And talking about trauma, we know obviously that trauma is experienced significantly in the neurodivergent population. We know that they're 4 times more likely to have PTSD or anxiety disorder. Why is that? And there are a number of domains in life where we know we experience traumatic events, sometimes in a familial environment in terms of our family, if we're the only member of the family that is neurodivergent, sometimes in social context in terms of being understood or unheard or unseen, and in communication difficulties, in the medical profession, because for a very long time we know that neurodivergence has been conflated with mental illness and is still classified in mental health data sets for the National Health Service in the UK under a mental illness protocol. And we also know that historically within psychiatry that, you know, social mores, popular conventions, and sometimes government policy has pathologized people with neurodivergence. And I would argue that, you know, an inclusive society doesn't need to pathologize anybody. Many people will have experienced trauma, particularly in education. And, you know, we have to understand and accept that our educational paradigm has strong eugenicist overtones. You know, we teach children how to be winners and losers, who comes top of the class, who comes bottom of the class, when we all know the research tells us that until puberty, children have no concept really of winners and losers, of some people being better than others. And this concept of intelligence within our education system as a catch-all, rather than a recognition that intelligence is multiple, that there are many different types of intelligence. But within our education system, it is intellectual intelligence that is prized above all others, and largely the only one that is measured in school exams. Many of us, of course, experience environmental trauma, particularly for those of us who have a very unusual sensory band, a sensitivity to light, noise, temperature, etc. And also compliance trauma, the compulsion to normal, the need to assimilate in order to belong to a social group, which we do all the time, whether it's the family group, the classroom group, the work colleagues group, the hockey club, the football team, whatever it might be. There is a pressure upon all of us to assimilate because we want to belong. We're a social species. And yet, what do we need to be in order to belong? Because if being different bars you from belonging, then inevitably you're going to experience trauma as a result of being rejected, isolated from social groups who do not see you as belonging there, that you're not like them. And the reality is, I think that in today's society, although we've seen this real growth of awareness in neurodiversity, you know, humans really are ill-equipped to contend with the adversities of life if we are dysfunctional as interrelating social beings. And that's a huge statement, I know. But really, we need some kind of cognitive reframing for society if we're ever going to reduce the potential traumatic experiences experienced by everybody, not just those who are neurodivergent. And again, that's particularly the case within medicine and education, because it really is within medicine and education that we often experience the most sense of being isolated, labelled as abnormal, having something wrong with us, being less than. And what we have, therefore, in our society is one that really creates a dissonance and a disconnect that sends our sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems into disarray, and our evolving capacity to reach our potential as human beings, as individuals and as a society, both psychosocially, intellectually, vocationally, are obviously quite often not met. And I'm not going to talk about this slide, but for those who are going to be watching afterwards, this is from Wellness, and it's really just a quick template around understanding how feelings can manifest in in behavior, in actions, and what some of the basic techniques that we can all do as part of our lifestyle to help us manage those. But for the moment, thinking about how we feel and how that influences how we act is really important in understanding the how and why many of us have been traumatized. I mentioned before that neurodiversity and mental illness have been conflated. We know that there has been significant gender bias, particularly towards girls and women. We know that there has been this notion that if you're neurodivergent, you're somehow intellectually inferior. You could have a genius IQ, but still fail all your exams. For example, if you have very pronounced dyslexia, because no matter what the exam subject is on, you're going to be downgraded for your spelling and grammar, for example. And what was really interesting as well in a recent survey amongst adults, and it was obviously in the middle of the pandemic when there was a great deal of what is now being coined as lockdown anxiety, that 70% of neurodivergent employees said that they were experiencing mental health challenges, and only 36% believed that they were in good physical health. And interesting that over 53% of Gen Z now identify as neurodiverse. I mean, I think there's a preference among younger people to use the term neurodiverse rather than neurodivergent. I think the two different terms have been helpful historically in terms of trying to understand the difference, but increasingly certainly seen by many young people who in their social groups are much more diverse. You see friendship groups amongst young people where you have children of different races, faiths, and different interests, but also dyslexic, autistic. I know when I went to school, the neurodivergent children were hidden away in a classroom. They were never the kind of children who appeared on the stage at awards evening. They were definitely seen as not like us. And the premise was, well, if you're not learning and achieving, it couldn't possibly be because of the teaching or curriculum. It's because there's something wrong with you, or you're less intelligent, or you're lazy. But the reality is, if you look at the World Health Organization metadata around dyscalculia, we're talking at least 1/5 of humankind are neurodivergent. And therefore, there must be an evolutionary reason why so many of us think differently. And that we perhaps need to move away from these very arbitrary lines that constitute a diagnostic threshold when we know that context is what determines our impairments and challenges and potential sources or contexts of thriving and success. And it's interesting, isn't it, that 70% of all school exclusions, certainly in the UK, are for these same children, which begs the question, I wonder if Einstein or Da Vinci or Helena Roosevelt or Disney or Henry Ford would have been in the special needs class, or one of those children who were excluded if they were at school now. And when it comes to public services, a survey in 2019 by the Embracing Complexity Coalition told us that 43% of neurodivergent people said that they just couldn't access health services, that health services didn't really understand them or take their neurodivergence into account. And, I've heard lots of examples of people who were saying that they were experiencing a lot of pain, being told, no, you can't possibly be experiencing a lot of pain. We've already given you a painkiller. Presumably they had exactly the same efficacy on everybody, when we know that's not the case. And we're seeing increasingly what is being called the age of identity and identity politics. And I've mentioned this thing about, well, neurodivergent versus neurotypical. I mean, why can't we all just be humans who are simply different? And these three kind of categories were, depending on what lens you're in, within a medical paradigm, it's well, what is wrong with you? And we talk in the medical model around the disease burden of autism, for example, and how much it costs the economy, because there is significant lower employment in for example, in the autistic community. Within the educational paradigm, it's, well, how intelligent are you? By that, they mean a very narrow definition of intelligence. And within a neurodiversity paradigm, it's not what's wrong with you, it's what is wrong with you? What is it about you that is different, and how do we celebrate that? Let's look at some of these figures around, increased vulnerability to, things like OCD, PTSD, eating disorders, particularly obesity, anxiety and depression, very significantly higher prevalence than in the general population. We know that people with autism and ADHD have a vulnerability to certain inflammatory conditions like Crohn's, IBS, colitis, allergies such as asthma and hay fever, atopic skin allergies like eczema, for example, greater vulnerability to things like neurofibromyalgia and arthritis. We also know there are correlations with early onset cardiovascular disease and migraine. Does that mean that that is part of our genome, or is that a consequence of a lifetime of elevated levels of stress hormones and pervasive levels of anxiety, because we live in a world that's not really designed to understand, see, or hear people with neurodivergence? The reality is that there are significant disadvantages, but correlations are not cause. And quite often it's been the case where, well, you have this diagnosis, therefore you have this. But it's interesting that a lot of physiological health problems associated with neurodivergence, which can in themselves be psychologically traumatizing, is that none of those physiological things are part of the diagnostic criteria. And yet it's widely understood and accepted that there are those kind of physical health concerns amongst the neurodivergent population, particularly again with regards to mental health. And this very significant gender bias around girls and women, which we know has had a significant impact, not just on the life chances and career-wise, economic independence, etc., for young women, but increasingly now nearly half of all adult diagnoses in the UK and Ireland are for women. And we know that many women have gone through significant problems, particularly in relation to reproductive health and menopause, which Professor Sandra Curry has been pioneering in her research and in bringing that very much to the public consciousness. So many women who've been experiencing very significant challenges around cognitive impairment and emotional dysregulation during menopause, who've been dismissed as being emotional, or you can't possibly be experiencing. It's just the menopause, was one phrase that one woman kept on saying to me. That was what was said to me. All of these things we know are traumatizing. So all of this, of course, we're all familiar with. But I'd like to come back to this whole idea of, something that Emma said before about, trauma happens in us. And we need to kind of understand, I guess, a sense of how trauma affects us as human beings, as a species. We're a self-learning, self-replicating species with quantum information processing encoded in every single cell of our body. Memories are encoded into our cells. And as a social species that thrives in relationship and therefore needs to attach, again, which Emma spoke eloquently about before, we're programmed, we are pre-programmed to experience distress when we feel isolated, where we are not protected by the social group. And as a consequence of that, we are genetically programmed to crave, to yearn and seek out attachment and connection to other human beings. It has been absolutely integral to our evolutionary development. And if we think about context as well, our brain circuitry completely rewrites itself in childhood. And then again, there is a very significant period of neuroplasticity in adolescence, where our human intelligence takes inventory of our life so far, and that information in adolescence informs the kind of neural pruning and neurogenesis that takes place that will prepare us for adult life. Because when we're born, we're incredibly vulnerable, unlike, you know, a dog or a horse that can get up and walk within sort of minutes of being born. We can't. We're incredibly dependent. We need to have constant closeness and attachment to our caregivers, because the unfolding of our genetic potential relies on connection and attachment and nurturing relationships from our primary caregivers. And of course, thinking about that, that actually begins in utero, but particularly in adult life. And while neuroplasticity might not be as extensive in adult life, certainly in adolescence, childhood, it is absolutely crucial. The prefrontal cortex of our brain, which really only kind of came into development about 50,000 years ago, created this new form of integration between our primitive survival mechanisms in our brain, in our limbic system, or emotional brain as it's being called, and plays this really powerful role in connecting all those brain regions to work in a more integrated and coherent way. Synaptic symphony that Mozart would be proud of, and coded in a way that Da Vinci would be proud of. We are an incredibly intelligent species, and yet our neurodivergence from the perspective of our genome is a very, very small part of our potential, and yet ironically has been one of the reasons why so many neurodivergent people have experienced significantly poorer life chances across a whole range of indices. So with that major neuronal growth and pruning, you know, in childhood and adolescence, if we're confronted with pervasive levels of anxiety, then that innate need that we are born with to explore and discover the world that we live in, that confidence in self-efficacy and protection and safety and attachment through belonging to a social group and with primary caregivers, that need to learn, that desire to learn, the courage to learn and explore our world is stunted, rather, because these, you know, these evolutionary signals that compel us to explore our world are then being contradicted. They become incoherent because we're locked in survival mode, because we experience the environment we live in as non-viable for us. And in essence, the environments we live in that can cause trauma also then change the architecture and the function of our brains. And, you know, as human beings, I think, speaking as an entrepreneur, I mean, many of you will have heard the research about 29% of people with ADHD are entrepreneurs. You know, I think entrepreneurs have a default mechanism of optimism. But I think as human beings, generally, we are innately prone to be hopeful. There is this self-actualization that Roger's talked about, or individuation that Jung talked about. And, you know, that is a striving that is part of who we are. It's part of our evolution. Trauma flips that default mode network from that, you know, hopeful, optimistic, explorative, almost excitable exploration of our world, is then flipped into one where we develop fear of other humans and fear of our environment. And then I see this in many of the children I've worked with, a learned helplessness. They've been programmed. You can't do this, you can't do that, you're not able to do this, you're not able to do that, as if the world wasn't safe. You know, it didn't feel safe enough, particularly on the school playground. Then we know that that instinctive actualization and development is impaired, and that, of course, results in physiological and psychological health problems, self-isolating, and of course, various attachment styles, which Emma talked about before. So if this need for social connection drives our genetic adaptability, then it's interesting, isn't it, that currently, within the academic research, it's saying that IQ has increased about 30% over the past 50 years, but actually it correlates with increased level of mental health problems. And we know that pervasive levels of stress, we've mentioned, and elevated sort of stress hormones like cortisol, impact and undermine that integration of brain regions. But I think it's interesting, isn't it, that with the advent of artificial intelligence, where speed of processing and volume of processing is being heralded as something that perhaps will leave us more cognitive energy for other things. One can only hope that that might be through more human connection and relating. So this phenomenal nurturing connection that we have as human beings has opened up these evolutionary new neural pathways and greater executive functioning, and thankfully now a recognition that spiky cognitive profiles are the norm, that intelligence isn't a single concept, it is many things, and that we know that when that connection to other people, the relationships, the attachment, is impaired through trauma, then it can send us back, if you like, into a more primitive defensive mode that disables us from really achieving our full potential. So again, I think this idea that the mind of the human being and the body, because they are one and the same thing, has to defend itself against a world that is seen as hostile, excluding, unwelcoming. And neuroplasticity, as I said before, is competitive. And it's a very challenging thing, isn't it? Particularly in childhood, you just think children are learning how to behave. There are so many different contexts. There are different behavioral mores in the classroom to there are on the playground. It's very challenging, and yet at the moment we see a number of children, I think many young people far more socially aware than any generation before them, but clearly many much more troubled. And it's raising now many questions about, well, what is education for? What is it we are teaching? Are we really preparing young people to make a successful transition to adulthood, to independent living, to employment, to economic independence, to active citizenship? What is the value of the academic examinations that we do in the most formative years of any human being's life? Because our brain doesn't reach maturity until we're about 25. And then we also need to look at some of the global issues around trauma. You look at what the pandemic did. We knew that there was a particular elevation in the number of many previously undiagnosed neurodivergent people now experiencing greater levels of dysregulation of one form or another. And also now questioning the research data that we've had around life chances and outcomes for neurodivergent people. I remember looking at the National Health Service website page when I first realised that I had ADHD at 29. And of course, when I looked at that, officially you grew out of ADHD on your 16th birthday. But when it changed later on, I think in the early 20s, people with ADHD are more likely to become alcoholics, drug addicts, and commit crime. And I thought, well, there's a vote winner, isn't it? For anybody trying to understand themselves, that's the first thing that you read, because we have data that says these are the outcomes. Well, they might have been the outcomes for the very small number of people who ever got a diagnosis in school, which were the ones that invariably the schools didn't want in the classroom. And you have to now wonder, is some of the life chance data around neurodivergence accurate when we know now that 80% of people with NDs have never been identified in school? And now we're hearing research about over 50% of all engineers are autistic, and over 50% of people in the legal profession are autistic, and 40% of millionaires are dyslexic. So we're seeing all this other kind of research coming out that seems to counter what the medical model says we are and we will be. And I think that the information that's being made available, both when we're young and as adults, can itself be traumatizing because it's not balanced, it's overtly medical model, it's deficit based. And really what we need to see now in terms of enabling people to understand well-being and self-care, as somebody who has worked with therapeutically with people with ADHD for many years, who've come to me with experiencing trauma and particularly PTSD, trying to help them understand that actually the first stage of recovery is also about understanding that if you understand your ADHD, your autism, your dyslexia, embrace it, accept it, celebrate it. There is nothing wrong with you. You also understand that while it might make you exceptional in certain things, whether that's as an engineer or as an entrepreneur or whatever it might be, there are certain vulnerabilities that place you at greater risk of developing some mental health problems or physical health problems as a result of living in a world that's designed for neurotypical people rather than neurodivergent people, and that you need to understand that not just your brain, but your whole body is involved here. And even if the diagnostic criteria is just based on cognitive functioning, we've got to accept, haven't we, that how we feel affects our physical health, not just our emotional well-being. And that learning how to self-calm, self-soothe, and integrate daily habitual stress reduction strategies like yoga and mindfulness, and I mean proper mindfulness, not the 10-minute easy version. Things like progressive muscle relaxation, breathing at 6 hertz for 20 minutes a day. All of these things help to create greater coherence between our sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system, so that we don't feel overwhelmed when we're confronted with stressful or traumatic situations, and mindful as well of how we have become programmed to anticipate and expect rejection or difficulty or lack of understanding, not being valued by various social groups because we're not like them, when really everybody has got a brain as unique as their fingerprint. In fact, everybody's genome is unique. There isn't a single other person on this planet that looks like or sounds like you as an individual. And we have to start from a holistic basis. There are so many different interventions that could be used to help alleviate trauma for people who have been significantly impaired by trauma. And everything from sort of attachment theory, by Bowlesby, things like regulation, narrative therapy, family systems therapy, all of these things are helpful. But really, I think what we do need is very much a holistic approach. There is something called the connecting dots or CDT approach, which is a relational framework where there is relationships both with self, with others, with parents, all of which are explored as part of developing the ability to self-regulate, co-regulate, and reducing the kind of vulnerabilities that there are to mental health problems. So it's a methodology that actually combines several well-known evidence-based theories, because again, we look at the data and we say, well, CBT is effective with X% of the population. I know that most people with ADHD particularly have found CBT completely ineffective unless it was provided by an ADHD informed cognitive behavioral therapist. And we know that therapeutic alliance is a key significant factor in therapeutic outcomes in psychological therapies. So it is about really understanding the unique experience of the individual and understanding their neurodivergent profile. And I think for me, with any of the clients I use, I always do a full cognitive profile as part of the process of assessment and contracting, because quite often many people just don't know what their cognitive profile is and how it impacts on them, either in a positive or a challenging way. So there's a few key things here to consider. First of all, we know that misdiagnosis is traumatizing. We've seen many, many people with ADHD misdiagnosed as having depression, anxiety, etc. Because if you were intelligent or you had a degree, for example, you couldn't possibly have ADHD. If you weren't a male, because it was predominantly something about naughty, fidgety little boys. There's been a great deal of misdiagnosis, particularly amongst women. Many women treated for years as bipolar, when in fact it wasn't that. ADHD wasn't even on the general psychiatry curriculum until a few years ago, when many general psychiatrists couldn't kind of grasp that you could be depressed and hyperactive at the same time. We know that diagnosis or identification is an epiphany for many people, and it can be life-changing. I think I'd like to get to the stage where we don't use the word diagnosis particularly, rather I prefer identification. But I am aware that currently the model in the society we live in is that, for example, without a diagnosis, particularly in education, your needs are never going to be seen or met. So we're a long way from getting to that point. And then we also know that misdiagnosis completely can also be incredibly traumatizing if you look back in retrospect, because most of the people I have known, everybody I've known in adulthood who was diagnosed in adulthood as autistic ADHD, have said that that was the best thing that could have happened to them. They know about it, at least they now understand. They don't regret finding out, because we need to understand ourselves and our relationship with the world that we live in and the people that are in it. And it's helpful to understand, well, maybe that's why I experienced this differently. I remember as a child realizing that I was colorblind. I see the color spectrum in a very different way from everybody else. My experience of those colors was real and accurate to me, the way my brain processed them. It doesn't mean that I'm abnormal or disordered necessarily. And thinking then about how we, reframe traumatic events through psychological talking therapies, making sure that there's a recognition of neurodivergent relevant issues, again, something that Emma touched on before, understanding things like interoception, alexithymia, masking, sensory issues as an important part of what the therapeutic model might look like, that's tailored to the individual, and also particularly things like overwhelm, chronic fatigue, burnout, and rejection sensitivity. All of these things, I think, are significant factors that need to be included and understood and inculcated into any therapeutic process that's going to enable people through that journey of recovery from trauma. Other interventions, things like eye movement, EMDR, seen some very significant results with this, even though we still don't quite fully understand why eye movement exercise is incorporated through psychological therapy have such a profound benefit, particularly for people with PTSD. And then also, somatic psychotherapy, which is the whole combination of mind-body interventions that can be used quite successfully, because again, people need to understand what self-care looks like and also how trauma manifests physically. Why we might experience knotting of the stomach, for example, which is, often the most obvious manifestation of anxiety in children, isn't it? They don't have the language or the self-awareness to even assimilate what's going on, never mind articulate it, but they will say that they've got an upset stomach. Understanding that whole mind-body link as well, and how we use that and lifestyle changes and healthy lifestyle choices. And remember, and I say this to clinicians all the time, you say, well, I told the patient that they had to do that. I'm like, right, okay, so you told them, did you show them? Did you explain to them why it helps and why they need to do it and how to develop and habitual behaviors over time so that they are fully integrated into their lifestyle? Because it's very, very difficult when you have gone for years thinking the same way, acting the same way, to suddenly start changing that, but recognizing that it is an important part of your recovery in order to have the kind of quality of life that you need. And commitment and acceptance therapy, of course, has already been mentioned. We know that pharmacology is really helpful for some people whose experience of trauma has been particularly disabling. So SNRIs, things like trazepine, which are, the modern version from what we had sort of 30, 40 years ago when we were using things like monoamine oxidase inhibitors that had a lot of unpleasant side effects. There are now, combined serotonin and noradrenergic reuptake inhibitors that can be very helpful. There's research being done at the moment about how pharmacology could be used to change how GABA is produced, particularly in the hippocampus, which we know that part of the brain in the limbic system, which can shrink as a result of trauma and PTSD, pervasive levels of anxiety across the lifespan. And there's also, again, some research that proves that psychostimulants such as methylphenidate, I've seen really good outcomes for people with anorexia who have used psychostimulants as part of the whole treatment regimen that's really worked for them, which sounds a complete contradiction, doesn't it? Because many of us know that it can be an appetite suppressant, but actually it's about understanding the manifestation of the cause of the anorexia, and invariably it's been some kind of trauma or cumulative trauma that has manifested in something like an eating disorder or obsessive compulsive disorder. And then, of course, I mentioned about artificial intelligence. It is going to revolutionize the kind of cognitive competencies that we currently value in our society. And this, I think, interesting conversations that's going on at the moment, because historically we've valued reason over emotion. And as you will have gathered from sort of what I was talking about before in terms of our evolutionary development, our intellectual development could only have been possible once we had learned the survival and attachment intelligences that we needed in the first place. And I think that certainly AI is going to transform our education system. What's, I think, particularly interesting in this brave new world, in a conversation I had last year with Emily LaProust, who's the chief executive of Risk Bioscience in San Francisco, and she said the really, really interesting thing is going to be the fusion of synthetic biology and artificial intelligence, which she believed will redefine neuropsychology. And she explained to me that they are only a decade away from putting the entire contents of the internet onto synthetic DNA that would fill a suitcase. In other words, there's this recognition that human DNA in every cell of your body has this incomprehensible potential to store information, code information, and change its genetic expression. Artificial intelligence is an interesting concept when you consider the genius of the human genome and the fact that diversity is the universal design, diversity of mind. So in summary, really just to reiterate what's been said over the past couple of days, we know that complex trauma results from prolonged and repeated traumatic experiences. And we know that there has been an overemphasis on genetics as a cause of disease or disorder, because we know that early environment plays a very significant part in how the genetic expression of ADHD, autism, etc., manifests. And that there, again, for too long has been this conflation between mental illness and neurodivergence, which needs to end very, very quickly. And really, that it is about society embracing a neurodiverse paradigm. We're beginning to see that now. And this growing number of people who are identifying, concerned that there is a response from, people saying, oh, well, it's overdiagnosed. We all know that it isn't. But it's not about diagnosing things that are wrong with people. It's about identifying this incredible diversity of mind that exists within human beings and recognizing that, in a world designed for neurotypical people, in a world that's not designed to even be here or accept people who don't think like us, who don't learn like us, who are not one of us. That is the reason why there are some poorer life chance trajectories for the neurodivergent population. So I think, what we need here is better public health education. We need a more inclusive pedagogy within our education system, and within public policy around our understanding of enculturation and socialization, so that what we see less of in the future is traumatizing experiences for neurodivergent people in every domain of life. Thanks very much indeed.
Thank you so much, Tony. That was great. You got everything into this presentation that we needed to hear here. Can I just so there's one question here, and I have one question as well, but I'll ask the one from Becca first. Hi, Tony. You mentioned completing a cognitive profile as part of the contracting stage with individuals we work with. Do you mind expanding on what specific you consider / measure you use?
I use the Do It profiler. And the reason for that is because it's a strength-based report. It's holistic. It, I think, challenges this notion of a kind of an arbitrary, you're dyslexic, you're not dyslexic, because all of these different executive functioning skills and cognitive competencies, we all have to varying degrees. So as a report, not only do you get this beautifully simple diagrammatical kind of map of your cognitive profile and the different executive functioning skills like planning and organizing and things like that, you also get a whole list of strategies around this might help you with this assistive technology might help you with this might be one of the ways or one of the reasons you might struggle with this, but if you try this approach. So it's a really constructive and formative report as opposed to an assessment of what you are lacking.
Yeah, thank you. That's we really do like the Do It profile, so that's why the Institute is also offering that out as part of partnering. Now, what we talked again about yesterday, which I thought was quite good, and I would like to push harder, is to try to, in this diagnostic, to put in some of the strengths, like the patterns seeking abilities, the extra creativity levels, and the non-linear thinking. If we brought that into diagnostics, it could be maybe easier for us to differentiate between someone who is purely traumatized and someone who is neurodivergent and traumatized. And instead of it sounded yesterday, it was so difficult to split that up. But looking at the strengths would really do that, in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, I think the paradigm has always been, there is something wrong with you, you are less than.
Yeah.
without a recognition that with certain neurotypes, we know that there are certain extraordinarily enhanced cognitive abilities. But we have historically defined people's intelligence by how they did in our education system, for example, and therefore their profession. So the assumption is, well, you are intelligent because you've got a degree or you work in this profession, as if intelligence was one single thing. And I think within assessments, because the medical model is premised on defining people by what is wrong with them, what is impairing them, and not recognizing the many potential positives of different neurotypes. And again, I think it harks back to this idea that it's like the eugenicist notion of some people, of course, are intellectually superior. Some people are genetically superior. In the UK, right up until the 70s, in schools, a child of colour was automatically defined as educationally subnormal based on their race. Up until 1994 in the UK, if you were LGBTQ, you were classed as mentally ill. The medical profession has defined neurodivergent people using words like retarded and handicapped, and this language, this conversation is evolving, but it's always premised on you're not like us, and this is how we're going to explain or define why you're not like us. Therefore, there is something wrong with you or inferior about you. And I think inferiority and superiority complex, which was a coin defined by Alfred Adler in the 30s, is a really important point to start when we start looking at, well, why have we all been enculturated into this idea that some people are winners and some people are losers, and some people are just superior genetically or otherwise than others, when really our true value as human beings is the same for everybody on this planet.
Right. We're here to change that. So
yeah,
just a quick, so Abby, just to say what we talked about is something called Do-It profilers, DOIT, Do-It profilers, and it's with Lexic, an organization called Lexic, and it's made by Amanda Kirby. So if you Google all of those, it will pop up. So, and we have Monica. Where can I find information on CDT therapy? Can assistant psychologists be trained on it? Thank you.
Yes. If they can email me, I'm more than happy to send some information.
Excellent. Thank you. So,
I mean, it's a composite approach.
Did you put your email in your presentation in the end?
I didn't know, because it was going to go on YouTube, and I knew that I would get thousands of emails in my inbox. But if you could pass that on for me, I'd be more than happy to reply.
Would you mind? It's in the Q&A. Would you mind just typing an answer to that?
Yeah, of course.
Can I just ask a final sort of slightly provocative question that some people have sort of, I've discussed it with people a lot. So a lot of what you talked about with this social exclusion and how it leads to trauma, loneliness, and so forth, and I completely agree on that. I personally feel that that social exclusion is a form of oppression of us that derives specifically from what Emma said. They see us, they recognize us something different, don't like it, push out. What is that if that's not oppression? But is that too strong a word to use? Because obviously it's been used historically in cases of slavery and things that are horrendous. But for us, this social exclusion, not all of us survive it, right? A number of us actually feel it necessary to take our own lives. Of course, we can't live with it. So what is that if it's not oppression? I don't know what your thoughts on that is.
I think I agree with you. It is oppression. But I also think there is also there is often a part of us that doesn't want to see ourselves as a victim and as helpless, however oppressed we might be. But we need to recognize where that oppression happens often in subtle and nuanced ways, not always in very overt ways. You know, whether it's through microaggressions or overt discrimination in access to health or employment. Often we don't know we're oppressed because we are conditioned into believing, as many children in school are, that, well, you're not like the rest of us, you're less intelligent, you're less able. That we integrate that kind of oppression into our self-concept. So I think the changing national conversation, and I think whatever the challenges around our traditional academic institutions and medical institutions and research and government policy, all of that will only change when the population say, I will not let you label me disordered. I will not let you label me as mentally ill just because I'm gay. I'm not going to let you label me as educationally or intellectually inferior just because of my race. Similarly, now what we're seeing is this response from the public that's saying, this is not how I am going to allow you to oppress me and define me in a deficit-based lens.
Thank you so much, Tony. We've gone over time. In fact,
so
we're going to cancel our 5 minutes break. I hope that's okay for everybody. Thank you so much for your time and your presentation, Tony. Really appreciate that.
Thank you.
Sophia, welcome, and thank you so much for your patience in the background. We get very, as you know, we all get very passionate about what we talk about, but we would love to hear from you now, please. So Sophia Ahmed is a neurodiversity. We'll talk about neurodiversity and the echoes of partition, intergenerational trauma, identity, and resilience in post-1947 South Asian families. A journey of many migrations, a case study on collective memory, neurodivergent narrative, and healing across generations. Sophia Ahmed is a visionary educational consultant, leadership advisor, and keynote speaker dedicated to boosting organizational performance through compassionate, inclusive practices. With over 2 decades of expertise spanning education, mental health, and business leadership, she empowers institutions to drive social justice, equity, and systemic transformation. A doctoral candidate in neuroscience and psychology of mental health at the University of Warwick, Sophia combines academic rigor with real-world impact. Her work is rooted in specialties such as trauma-informed care, special educational needs and disabilities, and diversity, equity, and inclusion. She further enriches her practice through ongoing training, including an upcoming master series in trauma at the University of Oxford, which in fact is where I met you the first time, Sophia, and enjoyed your presentation there as well. So welcome, and thank you so much for giving us your time here.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
I'm trying to share my screen. I have had the worst of technological freakishness. So I'm trying to share my
So is it not so
I'm trying to get to my desktop.
Sharing what happens if you take this page down? I'm such not a technology person.
Okay.
But if you take that down up in the corner, will that cut you off as well? I was hoping not.
Just wondering how to get to my
So if you're up here, if you press on this X, would that take it down or no? Or over here on this one? I'm not sure.
1 sec. Let me just get rid of all of that. Can you only see me?
No, we can see your desktop now, and you.
You can?
Yes.
That's good. So that should be 2 monkeys.
Very cute monkeys in water.
Okay, lovely. Okay. We'll get there eventually.
Yeah, it's fine. And here's a PowerPoint, Microsoft PowerPoint.
Oh, lovely.
Excellent.
Finally.
I know the feeling. Don't think anyone hasn't been there.
I know. Right. Okay. Where?
I will come off screen, but I'm right behind. Yeah.
Thank you for having me so much. Tony, you're a very hard act to follow. In fact, all of my esteemed colleagues, I'm very much a novice in terms of everybody else's experience, but thank you for having me. Apologies for putting my whole PhD thesis proposition in the title of the presentation. It's quite a mouthful. It should have been smaller, shorter, more concise. And trust me, I did cut about 4 lines out. So in essence, this is an account, if you like, of displacement, migration, immigration, settlement, refuge, and the ripple effects on the human condition and its psyche, and an attempt to reconcile and understand. So full disclosure, this is a work in progress. I am a work in progress. In order to understand the trauma of partition, special needs, neurodiversity in the context of the South Asian experience, I'd like to begin with my story to give this talk context, because this is where I'm coming from and this is where my studies are coming from. Charlotte, if I overrun, just stop me, because I think my notes have completely gone over the 30-minute allocation.
So I will put myself on screen when it's coming to where I need you to roll.
Brilliant. Yeah, I'm happy to stop whenever you stop me. So I am 3rd generation British Pakistani. I was born in 1972 in London, and I'm the eldest of 3 daughters. My grandfather came to England with my grandmother and their 4 daughters in 1959. And this was not their first life-changing migration when they came from Pakistan to the UK. My ancestors hailed from the Indian subcontinent. On my mother's side, they were Rajput warriors, and on one side, and on the other side, they were Mughal lords. My father's side, the family could actually trace their lineage back to the time of the Prophet Muhammad in Arabia in 1400 CE. So this is why Asians and Pakistanis think genealogy finding businesses are bizarre conceptually. We know where we come from as a mark of great pride, countless generations before ours. We know our ancestors, we know from whom and where we hail, but we are perhaps a little less aware of the historical trauma we carry in our genes and how to deal with it. So my mother migrated from India, a town called Qadian in the Punjab, to Lahore in the newly formed Pakistan in 1945. From Lahore, her family were to then move to a newly created town called Rabwa in 1953. And then in 1960, they migrated from my mum and her whole family from Rabwa, Pakistan to England. They traveled to the UK by road in a van with no seats. The van had a few families and one lonely 16-year-old boy with nothing and no one who would to his name, but one day he would become a millionaire in England. It would take them 2 weeks to travel through Asia and Europe to finally reach England. Growing up, my grandfather would narrate many accounts of the adventures on their journey. By the age of 19, my mum was sitting her A-level English literature and language exams. So she had come here when she arrived. My mum was 7 or 8 during the partition. By the time she gets to England, she's 16 or 17. By the age of 19, she was sitting her A-level English literature and language exams. And her English teacher told her, after reading one of her essays, that she wrote better than the English girls. Salia Mahmood, who was my mum, was a trailblazer and a woman way ahead of her times. She was genius level clever and a very hard act to follow. Post-retirement, she wrote 21 books. And the first book, and you can see the picture on the right of my screen, was actually a biography of her father and his brothers. And she called it The Minarets of Light. And a heavy part of this book is about the partition and their journey and their family diaspora. She was very strong, but her weakness was that she didn't believe in weakness. And I think this was a direct result of her having to toughen herself up. At the age of 12, she was running the family finances, and from that time until she died, that's what she did that for herself, our family, my grandmother and grandparents, you know, until they passed away. She managed my grandparents' estate, and even when sisters, you know, fell apart sometimes, they trusted her implicitly, but her weakness was that she didn't believe in weakness, and she could never accept depression. She believed that one could control it, and I think this was a direct response to what had happened to her mum as well, and I will talk about that in a little bit. So she wrote between the ages of 65 to 80. She passed away when she was 80. She wrote 21 books. At 79, she was diagnosed with frontotemporal dementia. And from presenting symptoms of the dementia to the day that she died, she was ill for a year, which doctors were amazed at. They were amazed at her, and they thought that it was because she was so clever, and her brain was so functional that she actually masked and hid her illness. So she was ill for a number of years, but her personality was masking it. And in fact, it was only when my father died that she started to show symptoms, and she was very ill for a year. So, and I'm convinced that trauma had everything to do with, you know, my mum's illness, and also her mother had all the symptoms of FTD, but my aunt, her younger daughter, whilst they were a family of doctors, they would not get her. They don't accept it, and they didn't get her diagnosed. And whilst there's no blame, it's just really interesting for me, because frontotemporal dementia is genetic. And just as in terms of responsibility, some people don't want to know. I don't want to know whether I have the genes for it, but clearly there is something in our family on my mum's side in terms of that illness. So we go back to my father, and my father would recall when he left India for Pakistan, he was 12 years old. And the day that he left, he'd been playing cricket in a local playing field with friends, and his uncle's car, and a car was a rarity at the time, but his uncle was a very important person in the town that they lived in, came and told him, "We have to cross the border over to Pakistan now. Your parents and your siblings will follow in due course, but you're coming with me." It was a matter of safety. His parents did follow, and eventually my father emigrated to the UK when he was to marry my mum at the age of 32. So he had 30 years of being more settled in Pakistan. Different experiences, some similarities. My maternal grandfather and all but 2 of his 5 siblings were to leave their homeland and disperse around the globe. And whilst my father's parents didn't emigrate officially to another country, my father and his 9 siblings all migrated from Pakistan to move around the globe. So I was brought up in a very loving home, surrounded by extended family, grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins. Family who gathered at my grandmother Nani's house every Saturday, where we fought to sit in the TV chair with the best view of the TV screen. All innocently unaware at the time of the challenges that our parents had faced to get us to this seemingly comfortable life in England. But we were also to experience our own challenges very early on in life, in terms of our religion and our race and our beliefs. My maternal grandfather was a scholar and spoke 4 languages. He had a master's in philosophy and Arabic. He spoke English better than the natives, had been a British RAF engineer during World War II. My grandmother, his wife, my Nani, was a very simple and humble human being. Where what she lacked in degrees, she made up for in kindness and compassion. So when I was about, and for me this is important, and you're probably thinking, why is she harping on about her own history? But it's my history that's brought me to this point, has made me so interested in mental health, neurodivergency, neuroscience. when I was 10 years old, roughly, my grandmother became deeply depressed and unwell, and she would not leave the confines of her home for the next 10 years. So for 10 years, during that time, my mum and dad worked full time, and my grandmother was my caregiver. That's where we went after school. She took care of us. And we did not see her step out of the house. We didn't see her function in a way that we saw our mums function, going to work, going to the shops. She never learnt English, and I believe that that in itself was a trauma response, because she said that she felt that the English didn't like her and laughed at her. So when she came to England, she would have been in her 40s. And that experience of my grandmother having depression and paranoia was my first experience of mental illness, trauma, and the echoes of partition, as I would later come to understand it. So I am ADHD. I don't like to say I have ADHD because it sounds like a disease then, like saying I have diabetes. And I discovered I am ADHD whilst actually assessing a child, a pupil. It was a light bulb moment for me, and that was only 3 years ago. I'm almost 53, so I'd spent 50 years of my life not understanding myself, my personality, and forever comparing myself negatively to my 2 younger siblings. I graduated in law, then did a master's in law, and then a master's in education, and eventually became a teacher. And I've been a teacher since 2000. I'm a mother of 4 children, 2 of which are neurodivergent, 3 of which suffer from anxiety, and the age range is from 28 to twins who are 11. Been married 3 times and had my heart broken probably about 100 times, not just romantically. I became a deputy head and a head soon after I became a teacher, and now I work in consultancy in school improvement, in DEI, diversity, equity, race, inclusion, special needs, and I've done this for more than 10 years. I'm now pursuing a doctoral pathway in MSc in the neuroscience and psychology of mental health. All of the above brings me to you today. Here I am, in no doubt that there is a pattern, a rhyme, and a reason to me. And I truly believe that understanding fosters acceptance and compassion. I became involved in special needs and neurodiversity in the community beyond the classroom in 2018. It had been brought to Muslim leadership attention in the mosque community that I belong to, that the special needs community was underserved, misunderstood, and misrepresented, and therefore stigmatized. And so for me began a journey to educate, be educated, share knowledge, and spread the word. I have worked with NGOs, been on special needs roadshows in the UK, and have worked with SEND schools and organisations abroad, in particular in Pakistan. It's a very strange feeling, and one that is hard to describe. But when I land in Pakistan and take in my first breath and inhale that first breath, I feel as if I have come home. I was born in the UK. And even though Pakistan has not treated my minority community particularly well many times, particularly on a government basis and institutionally, I still love her. And the first time I visited Pakistan was 5 years ago. So I believe that there is something that we genetically pass on, that we inherit, that almost there are other things that we take on by osmosis, and that all becomes who we are today. The life decisions we make, the roads we walk, the roads we don't walk. And again, I think that understanding fosters acceptance and compassion, which is why I'm so passionate about taking my own understanding and knowledge of neuroscience and neurodiversity forward, particularly in relation to refuge, partition, trauma. So neurodiversity, partition, and the historical wound. In 1947, South Asia underwent an unprecedented rupture, a kind that history and the world has not seen ever before. The partition of India under British colonial rule resulted in the displacement of over 14 million people, and the death of approximately 1 to 2 million. And if you, when I was looking at these images and finding images of the partition, what made me really sad and confused was that we, as a race, humanity, whilst we've come forward in so many ways, made you know, so many huge steps in science, in what we call is civil society, civility. These images actually remind me of what's going on in the Middle East at the moment. They are so reminiscent of actually what's going on in 2025, and this is 1947. So with regard to the 1947 partition, amidst this geopolitical and communal upheaval, entire family systems, languages, identities, and communities were fractured. Neighbours who had lived together as brothers and sisters for generations, communities who had sat side by side for not hundreds but thousands of years, were declared enemies and became enemies. What was perhaps less visible yet equally profound was the psychological aftermath that spanned generations and is still spanning generations. So today I seek to place a new lens on that aftermath by asking how neurodiverse individuals and families processed, internalized, and transmitted the trauma of partition. Partition was not just a historical event, it was a psychic and social wound. The violence wasn't limited to borders or buildings, it etched itself into bodies and genealogies. Historians like Urvashi Bhattalia and Gayendra Pandey have described it as a catastrophic silence within families, a silence that echoes still in our collective psyche. So what happens when a child born decades later inherits these echoes? The term neurodiversity, and I'm sorry that I am preaching to those of you all know this, but just for the sake of going over certain facts, the term neurodiversity was first coined by sociologist Judy Singer in the 1990s, and it refers to the idea that neurological differences or exceptions, or what we consider the norms, are existent in society, such as autism, ADHD, dyslexia, and others, and that other natural variations of human diversity, not inherently disorders needing to be fixed. So this is something that I'm very interested in, the idea that if you are neurodivergent, the language that we use is so important, that the vocabulary used is normal versus abnormal, and rather than a way of being or a way of thinking, autism, ADHD, dyslexia have been labeled as disorders that need to be fixed. And you know, for someone who is in the spectrum of ADHD, amongst other things as well, I don't feel broken. Perhaps I think for every human being, life is challenging, and what I am and how my personality and my character will determine how I deal with life. However, I still don't think that I have a disorder, and that's not how I would like to, or how I ever talk about children and pupils when I work with them. So rather than viewing autism as a deficit, the neurodiversity paradigm recognizes the unique perceptual, cognitive, and emotional experiences of individuals who diverge from neurotypical norms. Neurodiverse people often possess heightened sensitivities to stimuli, deep pattern recognition, intense memory, or nonverbal communication forms. So what connects the partition and neurodiversity? First, neurodivergent individuals often process emotion, memory, and language differently. When these individuals grow up in families impacted by trauma and silence, their perception of that trauma may be acute and confusing, especially when elders avoid talking about the past. And, you know, if we look at in my context, I'm third generation. So my grandparents have gone, my parents have gone. So unless you talk, there is a lot of story sharing and talking, and an exchange of stories, you won't understand. You won't understand where you're coming from. Therefore, how will you be able to help map yourself in the future? Secondly, families dealing with trauma may mistake neurodivergence as an extension of their own post-traumatic distress, leading to misdiagnosis or depression. This is particularly so in societies and health structures that don't serve special needs and neurodivergent so well and have less awareness. And thirdly, there's increasing evidence that trauma alters epigenetic markers, meaning it can biologically affect offspring, altering stress response systems, which may overlap with certain neurodevelopmental sensitivities. I think that for most people who are in this field, I think that's a given now. I think that's something that we all accept and understand. The nature of trauma being generational and genetically, being passed through families and lineages. So by the end of this lecture, and I know I've been speaking for a while and I'm talking about by the end, but I hope to articulate a new critical framework, one that does not see partition and neurodiversity as separate historical or medical domains, but as overlapping terrains where identity, silence, resilience, and historical pain meet. So the partition of India in 1947 represents one of the largest, most violent displacements of people in modern history. Yet for decades, psychological and intergenerational impacts of this cataclysmic event had remained submerged beneath state narratives of independence and nation building. And I think that's still the case. Recent scholarship and testimony-based historiographies have begun to uncover the embedded trauma, much of it transmitted silently across generations. Trauma, particularly that which is collective, is not confined to the immediate generation of survivors. The term historical trauma, developed in Indigenous studies, Braveheart 1998, refers to cumulative emotional and psychological wounding over the lifespan and across generations, emanating from massive group trauma experiences. And partition fits squarely into this framework. And I do have to say that what's going on in the Middle East today, the situation of Palestine, this is in our modern times. Their trauma is something that is generational, and goodness knows how long. Where it will echo to, where its echoes and its ripples, where they will end. So Urvashi Bhattacharya's groundbreaking work, The Other Side of Silence, emphasizes that much of partition's trauma was buried in silence, particularly in women's stories and those of lower caste and minority communities in terms of the Indian experience. Families often refused to discuss the horrors they had witnessed. This silence, while protective, became a medium through which trauma was transmitted, not through words, but through behaviors, fears, and absences. Post-memory and hauntology. Marion Hirsch's concept of post-memory is crucial here. Post-memory describes the relationship that the generation after bears to the trauma of those who came before. And in modern day terms, Gabor Mate is at the cutting edge of this science. He's a prolific speaker and writer on generational trauma. It is experienced through stories, images, and behaviors so deeply ingrained that they seem to constitute memories in their own right. For neurodiverse individuals who often experience time, emotion, and memory differently, post-memory can be intensely disorientating or deeply embodied. Similarly, Jacques Derrida's idea of hauntology is useful in understanding how partition continues to haunt the present, not as an event long past, but as a spectral presence that interrupts national identity formation and individual psychologies. The field of epigenetics has given scientific grounding to what many intuited. Trauma can be biologically transmitted. Research by Rachel Yaluda in 2014 on Holocaust survivors has shown altered stress hormone levels in their children, supporting the idea that trauma levels have molecular echoes. And again, that is in history is one example. And we're living through something that will echo on for generations to come. So although such findings remain complex and evolving, they underline a key point. Trauma changes not only the mind, but the body, and by extension, the generational line. So where you have trauma, not only does it have psychological impacts, but you will see comorbidities arise on you physically, and by extension biologically, certain diseases. So for example, diabetes is very prevalent in South Asians, and that is supposed to be a direct response to being starved during colonial times. During, it was called the Bengal famine, and so their bodies adapted to lack of food, and now so many generations on, South Asians have a genetic propensity to diabetes more so than other cultures, and it's not necessarily to do, obviously a lot to do with lifestyle and food, but not necessarily. They are already predisposed to it. So in the South Asian context, this means that the effects of partition may be etched into the very physiology of its descendants. Heightened stress responses, anxiety, or predispositions to certain neurological sensitivities, which I believe was totally present with my maternal grandmother. She presented with depression, anxiety, in her hometown, she would take taxis, rickshaws. She was out and about, and she did not do that in the UK ever. And she suffered from diabetes, type 2 diabetes. So all of these links are very, very, and she had frontotemporal dementia, I'm sure. She had all of the markers for it. And again, my mum had the same, she was borderline diabetic, and she had frontotemporal. So I believe that generationally, our experiences manifest in who we become and our overall health. So, neurodivergent experience of inherited trauma. For neurodiverse individuals, especially those on the autism spectrum, trauma transmission may manifest uniquely. An autistic child might respond more intensely to intergenerational silence or family taboos. Non-verbal communication, often strong in neurodiverse people, might pick up effective cues from their elders. Shifts in tone, hesitations, avoidance of certain topics. Certainly when I was growing up, there were certain things that you simply did not talk about. It wasn't appropriate. And so adults would steer clear of those topics. There are anecdotal reports of neurodivergent individuals fixating on historical trauma sites, maps or timelines, obsessions which may be dismissed clinically, but could represent a deep emotional processing mechanism. Partition and the family system. In South Asian families, the structure is often hierarchical and collectivist. Partition disrupted these systems by killing members, dislocating family units, or forcing reconstitution in foreign environments. In these contexts, neurodivergence may be interpreted not as a difference, but as a threat to the fragile stability of the family, in terms of the lens that the family were looking at. Families that were traumatized may have expectations for normalcy and conformity in subsequent generations. A neurodiverse child with non-conforming behavior may be perceived as a continuation of historical failure or rupture, rather than as an individual with their own strengths. And I think facets of that behavior, that understanding, are still very predominant in Asian, South Asian cultures, families. Certainly in Pakistan, the understanding of special educational needs and disabilities is, well, it depends where you live. It depends on the education service, the local educational board, but it is limited. The work that I do, we have schools, and we help schools in countries like Ghana and Nigeria, and again Burkina Faso, and again in those areas in the outside of the cities, there's a lack of awareness, and therefore when you're teaching and assisting, you're coming from a completely different place in order to help people understand. So coming back to partition is remembered differently across India, Pakistan and Bangladesh. I mean, if we go back to the map here, you can see that the orange is India, and then the orange is India, and then you have Pakistan, which was at the time called West Pakistan, and on the right you have East Pakistan, which is now modern day Bangladesh. This was suggested by this division of Pakistan occurred on the suggestion of Lord Mountbatten and the British, but it was never ever going to work. You can't have two countries so disparate, geographically, and it was always going to cause division. And if you look right up to the north and the grey areas, that's the disputed Kashmiri areas that we see, fights going on even today. So partition is remembered differently across India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. State curricula often avoid its emotional depth, choosing instead nationalistic retellings. This dissonance between official history and private pain creates an unstable narrative field, one that neurodiverse individuals may find particularly difficult to navigate. Autistic individuals or children and young people on the spectrum, for example, often seek internal consistency and logic. When exposed to contradicting narratives of the past, they may react with anxiety or obsessive questioning, which can be misunderstood by families or educators unfamiliar with trauma-informed and neurodiverse frameworks. So partition's trauma is not a ghost of the past, not at all. It is an echo in the present. It is found in the silences around dinner tables, in the ways families avoid questions, in the cultural habits shaped by fear. And I think this is particularly poignant, the cultural habits that we take on and we inherit. For neurodivergent individuals, these echoes may not be background noise, they may be center stage. This section aims to highlight that neurodiversity is not separate from history, it is embedded within us. Understanding how historical trauma lives on in neurodiverse minds is essential if we are to move forward toward intergenerational justice, healing, and inclusion. So now I wanted to talk a little bit about neurodivergence in South Asian contexts. Understanding neurodivergence in South Asia requires a deeply contextual lens, one that incorporates colonial legacies, religious cultural frameworks, caste hierarchies, and shifting ideas of mental health. Unlike Western discourses that have gradually evolved towards strength-based interpretations of neurodiversity, South Asia remains constrained by stigma, underdiagnosis, and cultural misapprehensions. Historically, neurodivergent individuals in South Asia have been it's taken on a lens of pathology. They have been hidden or labeled in culturally specific ways as, sometimes, and you will see this in not just in Asia and South Asia, but in certain African countries and cultures where neurodivergent people are labeled as possessed, mad, or disobedient. And autism in particular has often gone undiagnosed, misunderstood as bad behavior or moral deficiency, where a child or a person is diagnosed with not being normal, and then I'm sure they'll become normal one way, and if they do X, Y, and Z, and if they could just listen in this way, then they could become better. So hyperactivity is frequently seen as willful disruption. So a complete misunderstanding of ADD, ADHD, and hyperactivity is seen as willful disruption, while sensory sensitivities may be dismissed as eccentricity. Again, this whole concept of normal and abnormal. There's also a historical lack of language for neurodiversity in many South Asian languages. While terms for mental illness or madness exist, nuanced understanding of neurodevelopmental variation is rare. So diagnostic categories such as ADHD or autism, ASD, ADD, often enter these societies through Western psychiatric frameworks, which do not always align with indigenous or familial ways of knowing. And, with my work in Asia and in Pakistan, I think one of the biggest challenges we've had in helping families and young people, older adults who are neurodivergent is language. Trying to make families understand in a way in which they will understand, because the language is simply not there. And just this concept of, oh no, he or she will get better. I'm sure they'll be better soon. They're just ill, and it's an illness and it will pass. So the experience of being neurodivergent is not uniform across South Asia. Access to diagnosis, therapy and education is profoundly shaped by caste and class. You know, caste in terms of India, class in terms of Pakistan and Bangladesh. Urban English-speaking elites are far more likely to receive clinical diagnoses and engage with global neurodiversity discourse. In contrast, working class and rural communities may experience neurodivergence through religious or spiritual paradigms, or ignore it altogether due to survival pressures. Moreover, neurodivergent individuals from lower caste communities are at heightened risk of institutional neglect, abuse, or criminalization. I mean, the stories that we have in Pakistan and in India and in South Asia and just economically struggling countries, that where the provision is made, particularly where it's hostels or it can be poor. There is more in the cities. There is more awareness, but neurodivergent young people and children are at much higher risk of neglect and abuse, systemically, institutionally. And, you know, just bearing in mind that we have a privilege in Europe and America of having a system that recognizes legally and lawfully child protection, child safety. And so, for example, talking of Pakistan, it doesn't have a legal framework to protect a child. So there's no necessarily, yes, obviously they have laws, they have a rule of law, but the way that we in whether we follow it or not, and there are flaws in our system, in European systems, American systems, but there is a bottom line framework that, for example, Pakistan doesn't have. So if you are neurodivergent and then have gone through trauma, are going through, you are at risk. You are at high risk throughout the course of your life. In terms of gendered expressions of neurodivergence, neurodivergence is also gendered. In patriarchal South Asian societies, girls and women on the spectrum are even more likely to be undiagnosed or misdiagnosed. And I think that that's kind of in pattern with world understanding. So, for example, a few years ago, 5-10 years ago, you know, the idea that there would be more women coming out almost and saying, yes, I've been diagnosed with ADHD, was perhaps anathema. And so if we're experiencing a level of, you know, otherness and bias and bigotry, then in countries that have less awareness, that is all compounded. So in terms of girls, their symptoms are often internalized or masked, are dismissed as emotional volatility or hormonal imbalance, cultural expectations of femininity. I think cultural expectation of femininity, that's a very broad brush again to paint. Again, it depends on literacy, on rural areas, city areas, but certainly in many contexts, women who are neurodiverse, their struggles are invisible unless they are in more literate, educated surroundings, or unless the family is educated and aware. Trans and queer neurodivergent individuals face further marginalization. For many, their gender nonconformity and neurological differences are pathologized together or seen as moral deviancy. oral traditions and hidden narratives. So despite institutional neglect, many neurodiverse narratives survive through oral traditions, mythic storytelling and ritual. And I think it's almost done without obviously doing it. It's not almost, it's an unconscious rendering of the narrative rather than a conscious. A child who repeats mantras or exhibits certain behaviors may be described as blessed or spiritually touched in some contexts. Others may be viewed as having special insight, especially if the differences are framed within religious scripts. In parts of South India, for example, children with apparent neurodivergent traits are sometimes affiliated with temple rituals or sacred roles. This does not always equate to empowerment, but it offers a different lens, one where difference is not inherently deficient. South Asian family systems emphasize, and I think that this is something that we have inherited even wherever we are, wherever Pakistanis, South Asians, Indians, Bengalis are, an emphasis on duty, respectability, and achievement. And with that come you hand in hand with that you have stigma. So where you make certain decisions that aren't necessarily respectable. If you're not achieving like your South Asian peers, then there is stigma attached. And so therefore, if you are making, if you have a certain lifestyle and you are neurodivergent, then sometimes people, and I've heard this say that, oh, he or she, they made these decisions and these life choices because they're not normal. There's something mentally wrong with them. But in post-partition households, these expectations are often or were often intensified by displacement trauma. So parents who had lost homes, countries, and loved ones may project their dreams and anxieties onto their children. And I think this is something that very much resonates in certainly third generation migrants from post-partition India and Pakistan and Bangladesh. And I think this is something that, whilst we try and work on in the next, the fourth generation onwards, it is a real struggle because we are fighting genetics as well, the trauma of genetics and everything that by osmosis that we brought on from generations. So, but it is, I believe, about awareness and education. So a neurodivergent child in such a family may be seen as a source of shame or failure, and this does happen in uneducated, less educated, less literate context. But actually, the work that I began in 2018 stemmed from the UK, families in the UK, where there was a lot of education that needed to be done around special needs and around mental health, and even around aspects of women's health, such as, perimenopause and menopause and hormones. So in terms of neurodivergent children in families, they may be seen as a source of shame or failure. They may be overcorrected, isolated, or subjected to curative treatments ranging from cultural interventions or discipline. Families may also simply refuse to acknowledge neurodiversion at all, preferring to maintain social facade over engagement. And you see this a lot in terms of social context, where you have a neurodivergent child in the mosque, where you should be, it's a quiet place when it's prayer time, and a neurodivergent child is loud or stimming or repeating a question to its mother, and then you'll have a third party saying, you need to tell your child to be quiet. So these were the things that we were trying to address. 7 years on, I think we've made a lot of headway in terms of bridging that gap, the gap of understanding and education. So despite these challenges, neurodivergent South Asians have carved out spaces of expression and resistance. Some use art, music, and digital storytelling to share their experiences. Others are building activist communities, particularly in diasporic contexts, where they can access intersectional frameworks. Initiatives such as Project Neurodivergent India and various queer disabled collectives are beginning to reframe South Asian neurodiversity, not as a Western import, but as an indigenous anti-colonial reality. To truly understand neurodivergence in South Asia, we must decolonize our diagnostic frameworks. Rather than impose DSM-based models that may erase local meanings, we should ask, what does difference look like here? What cultural metaphors hold it? What family stories encode it? Only then can we center neurodivergent voices not as pathological exceptions, but as vital participants in rethinking the very story of partition and its living legacy. I want to talk a little bit about language, identity, and silence. Language is never neutral. It carries the weight of history, power, and belonging. In post-partition South Asia, language has often been both a casualty and a victim.
Hello.
Indian, Pakistani, and then Sky, and then Al Jazeera. And the difference in language was it was profound. It was so interesting to see. So language is never neutral, but particularly in these where this almost the dialogue is, see, this is why we needed to partition, because we're so different and we're inherently we're enemies. Punjabi in its literacy form, or Urdu in certain regions, wasn't just a cultural loss, it marked a rupture in identity. So in where communities were pre-partition, they spoke Urdu, and the written language was in the Arabic form. These were supposed to, the language and the written form was supposed to cross over to Pakistan, and there was to be no remnant of it on the other side. So for neurodivergent individuals, especially those who rely on non-verbal or alternative forms of communication, these linguistic erasures created additional layers of silence. During and after partition, millions were forced to migrate, often losing not only homes, but also the very languages that structured their worlds. Urdu speakers in India, Punjabi speakers in Pakistan, Sindhi communities in Gujarat and Maharashtra, many of these groups faced assimilation pressures that led to generational language erosion. This linguistic loss is especially poignant for neurodivergent individuals. For some on the autistic spectrum, or scripting can be a motivational regulation. When family language itself becomes a site of rupture or abandonment, even these adaptive mechanisms, who migrated from Pakistan to America, and he migrated in his 20s. So for all of his life, up until his 20s, he spoke Urdu, but he had been through some hugely traumatic events, loss of siblings. And now, 30 years after moving to the States, he's absolutely adamant that he cannot speak Urdu, that he can only speak English. And again, this is a consequence and an impact of trauma. I wanted to talk.
Yeah.
Hello.
We have to wrap up soon, so we can.
Oh, that's fine. That's absolutely fine. I knew it would be like this. So next time. But if anybody's interested in my notes or any of the a few more case studies, then you're more than welcome. I can share my notes.
That would be great. Are you do you have an email you would like to share, or can people reach?
Yeah, I can. I'll put it in the comments. Shall I put it in the chat?
We have a couple of questions for you as well, if you don't mind.
Yeah, of course.
Straight to the panel with Tony and Emma as well, and yourself. So one is for Isha. Hi, Sophia. I'm so sorry if I pronounce your name wrongly. Am I doing it wrong?
No, that's correct. Totally correct.
I wanted to ask how you would navigate when South Asians undermine neurodiverse conditions. For example, believing that ADHD is something that everyone has, or that neurodiverse conditions are something that never actually existed until very recently. So how
I mean, this has been all my work since 2018. It's literally going in the community, and I think people need knowledge. They need examples, and an openness to talk about it. So I am always really, and my husband is Pakistani from Pakistan. So when we were married, he found it really like shocking, and even my in-laws, that I will happily say I have ADHD. I am ADHD. I will happily say I have 4 children. 1 is ADHD, 2 are dyslexic. To have, so I think that the only way that you can overcome the barriers is to talk. And you know, share experiences and provide a safe place within communities for neurodivergent families. When you provide that safety, you're giving them acknowledgement that what they have to say is true and has veracity. But this isn't one conversation. This is developing relationships with people, and carrying on that dialogue.
Definitely, yeah, no, very much. I mean, the whole reason the Institute of Neurodiversity was set up was to create community of us around the world, because I found that there was none when I got diagnosed over 10 years ago. When one of my children got diagnosed, it just wasn't. There's nowhere to go for people. For children, yes, but as soon as you turn 16, you kind of fell off a cliff, and there was nothing. And
100%.
so it's very important, and I respect that you're open with it, because I do know that in different cultures it's very difficult. We have ION set up in across Asia, across Africa, in Latin America. Every single country has their own ways of dealing with that, and the local people are sort of able to tell the world, just like you did now, very courageously, of your own story and your family experiences. And what you just talked about, everything is so pertinent and so important to understand, because trauma definitely travels through generations. I firmly believe in that. I think science believes in that by now as well. But what does it do to us who are already highly sensitive to a lot of things? And I think that's important to understand and talk about. The silence.
And it is a journey, isn't it? It's a journey of, I mean, I'm 50, as I said, I'm almost 53, and I was 50 when I understood, you know, and I was diagnosed with ADHD. And, you know, mental health is layered. Sometimes it's nuanced. And, you know, the more you know, the stronger you are. And I'm just far more accepting of myself now. I don't see myself as lacking or having deficits. I'm simply me. That's why I don't like to say I have ADHD rather than I am. And it's hard in a world where we have to navigate language and labels. It can be quite challenging, but.
And also when you go to other areas of the world, I'm kind of pushing a lot. So English is my second language, and like the words like neurodivergent, this doesn't exist in many other languages. So we were trying to find in a global way words that existed in other languages, which is why we have gone to say there's neurominority types and some neuromajority types. Because minority and majority kind of exist, but it has different connotations. We're just trying.
It's a real challenge. I mean, how many thousands of languages and dialects are there in the world?
That's right.
And I think that universally there has to be some words that are universal. So autism has to be always autism, and even though the acronym is English, even ADHD, you know, it seems there are ways to adapt it, but the biggest challenges I found in Pakistan, in places like Pakistan, was actually when you're giving talks and lectures and simultaneously translating from English to the native language. And, you know, it just becomes bigger, the explanation, rather than translating, you're actually giving a whole paragraph of explanation to one acronym.
Yeah. Yeah, no, we have to be quiet. I think it's great to talk more to you. I can see that Faita Rahman has just, she's helping us with ION in Pakistan and leading on that. I'd like to speak to you. as well. You can see in the.
I'm going to go into the chat now and put my
Thank you so
email
much.
in.
Lots of comments here also, people. We really appreciate your personal accounts and your sharing. It's of huge importance that these testimonies also come out and that we hear across different countries. Historically, this neurodiversity movement has been sort of the white Western movement, and that is only 20% of the world population. So we've got to have the 80% fully at the table and represent.
You know, I thought I understood. Like, I thought I had witnessed and stood born witness to so many different types of neurodiversity as, you know, a teacher here who's taught along. And then I went to Pakistan for the first time with this hat on.
Yeah.
And I went to a special needs school that is in a town which attracts students from all over.
Yeah.
And it's a converted house, and it was built to house probably 100 students, and now it has 500, and so
Wow.
they have to stagger their intake.
Wow.
And there I saw neurodiversity is just one facet of a child's life, where they were being where there was economic hardship, neglect, sometimes abuse. Children who were extremely autistic and behavioral, who presented in what what is neurologically accepted as more normal behavior, they were punished at home. So it was a real eye opener. And what amazed me was the tenacity of the teachers.
Yeah.
How they managed to teach.
Work with that, all of that. Yeah. Thank you. So would you mind having a look in the Q&A and just answer to, because everybody can then see there's lots of people who would like to be in touch with you and who really loves the work you're doing, including
Q&A. Yep, let me have a look.
And then if I can invite Tony and Emma to come in, and then we can start talking about things whilst you're looking at all the people who wants to talk to you. Thank you so much. But stay on and be part of this panel as well. Thank you so much. So hello, Emma and Tony. This was great, very diverse presentations today, which is really great, touching on so many different things. And what I'd like us to talk about now is, so how do we shape the future? What do we do to shape the future? And I was thinking that one thing to start with, Emma, if you would start with that, is in your mind, what is your North Star of what the future would look like? The distant North Star that we might never reach, but that we want to work toward.
I think there are so many things. I listened to the question yesterday of what's the one change everyone would like to make, and I really choose one. But I think a general direction that I'd love to see us all moving in, and which I'm so heartened to hear, you know, people talking today about moving in, is a really different conception of what neurodivergence means. And it's there when you hear people talking in events like today about understanding neurodivergence as a lived experience, as a shared experience between those people like us who are able to sit on the panel and tell you I feel like this, and my therapy clients who come to me and say this is how I feel, the people I assess, and as what we have in common with, and the insight we can provide for people who are not able to speak for themselves and to communicate those things directly, and also for us not to speak over those people as well, and to make sure that a really wide range of voices are included. And I'm aware that, you know, as a woman, I'm later on the list of people to make it into getting recognized as neurodivergent, but I'm white, I'm middle class, I'm professional, you know, I'm higher up the list than a lot of other people. And so a really inclusive understanding of what neurodivergence is like as a way of existing in the world, and that reflecting the wide diversity of experiences, and also for people to have for that to open the door for people to be able to recognize that in themselves, and for that to be respected. You know, there was talk yesterday about kind of needs-based approaches that no one who I've just given a letter to that says they're neurodivergent, they know more or less they're neurodivergent than they were yesterday. It's just that I'm allowed to sign the letter.
paper.
that says so. Why, I'm really pro self-recognition, self-identification, support with that process, if you like, but really needs-based supports and accommodations as well.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And Tony, what's your North Star?
I think that we get to a point where there is universal global recognition that this diversity of mind, this diversity of human neurocognitive potential is the universal design, that there's an evolutionary purpose behind it, and that I think a great deal of conflict in between humans would diminish if we accepted that diversity rather than try to control people, make people conform and comply, rather than embrace the fact that I think there is an intelligent reason why we all have a brain as unique as our fingerprint. And my hypothesis is, well, maybe it's because we were all meant to learn from one another as a social species, and that is why we all think differently. And I think if we could embrace that as a concept, then I think the world will be a much better place and a much safer place. I think inclusive societies don't need to pathologize people.
I completely agree on that. I mean, probably one person couldn't hold all of the different ways that our brains are actually wired. One person couldn't be thinking, linearly and at the same time thinking out of the box. And so there's a need for us to come as an ecosystem with different ways.
And what Sophia said, really is I mean, it's so true that we pass on trauma, not just through life experience and how we treat people and how other people treat us, but epigenetically.
Yeah.
That we need to understand our responsibility as individuals to humankind, and know that what we do now impacts on children who aren't even born yet, and not see it as a competitive world where there are always winners and losers, and where somebody has to be better than somebody else. That's not to say that elements of competition in human behavior are not a good thing. They can drive us to pursue our potential. But I think when we start from the premise that some people are somehow less than others, is a fundamentally flawed notion of what it means to be competitive.
Sophia,
You're so right that it comes from a place of judgment and privilege. It's when you think that you're stronger because of a certain framework that society has decided is strength and privilege. I always I don't like the word I hate the word tolerate. And when I'm lecturing, tolerate to me denotes that you don't like me, you don't particularly like who I am, what I am, but I'll put up with you, like a child might tolerate sprouts. But for me, when I'm lecturing on the lecture circuit, when I'm talking to young people and trying to open minds, I talk about pluralism. And it almost seems glib, but really we need to. It's the idea of kindness and compassion to all, to remind ourselves what humanity is. And I think that's what's so painful at the moment in 2025, when you look around the world everywhere, is that we've come so far, yet we haven't. And I don't think this is, it can't just be lip service. It's something that we really have to talk about and have dialogue and engage with people and go into spaces where we don't feel safe. I absolutely believe that, we will all find commonality between us. We're all probably coming from the same direction, but in order to make a difference, we actually have to go into places where we're not comfortable.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for that. The other thing I was thinking about a lot when you were talking, Sophia, around culture and silence. So for years now, I've been speaking to neurominority people all over the world, in many different countries, China, New Zealand, Australia, whichever. What has come across to me is that there is a way of being that we all seem to have when we come together. There is like a lack of judgment and an acceptance of people are whoever they are. So I'm not saying that it's completely universal for us, but I'm saying there's a strong feeling of that everywhere that goes across culture and nationalities and socioeconomic backgrounds. And I call that sort of the third culture. I think there's a third mind as well, in terms of it's almost like we have the culture we're born into, but we as new minorities also have a culture between us, which is why it's sometimes difficult between the neurotypes to accept each other or be together easily, because we represent different ways, almost different cultures within the different neurotypes of being.
I mean,
But
humanity transcends
silence.
culture. Humanity, rightness, and there are certain grey areas in life, and there, on a moral level, there are certain rights and wrongs, and but there's so much nuance in the world. Culture is something that impacts our lives, but it doesn't matter where any of us are from culturally, whether I'm Muslim and Pakistani, and you're from South Africa, or our humanity, we all belong to the human race, and that is our commonality, that our hearts, our kidneys, our livers, our structures are all based on the same model, pretty much. And I think that's where we have to build bridges to challenge bias when we see it against neurodivergent communities, race. There's so much in the world to challenge. If you're neurodivergent, if you're a Muslim, if you're a woman, and if you're a woman of color, that's a lot to contend with. But I firmly believe in the commonality of humanity, and compassion, and something that I have learned over time, but particularly since I've been diagnosed and being a teacher, more self-aware, is to be able to accept other people's views whilst not agreeing with them. And something that I've really had to work on is to learn how to say sorry.
Yes, yeah.
That I found growing up and in my 20s and 30s, it was for me a sign of failure, because I hadn't had it said to me very often at all. So these are all learned behaviors, and there are so many behaviors that we can unlearn.
There is. What I was getting at was, is that because you use the word silenced as well a fair amount. I'm just thinking, is there something to say about our way of being having been silenced or ignored, not acknowledged so far, and what can we do about that? I don't know, Emma, do you have thoughts on that?
Well, I think there are the ways in which, on an individual level, I think we can think a lot about masking and the ways that we are told explicitly, which we are shaped by the looks and the nudges and the disapprovals and the tuts, and the ways in which we learn and we mask ourselves, and the ways that, but also the kind of disconnection. And I think that the way that neurodivergent people have been able to connect directly through social media, through being able to do things online, which become much more accessible for people who, for all sorts of reasons, might struggle to go to a big conference, but to connect people across different locations around the world. I think it's become much more possible for us to speak to each other, and to have voices in public spaces. And also with the expansion in identification and recognition and diagnosis, there are more people who are already in these places where they do get heard, and people who've kind of done this kind of Trojan horse model of kind of getting into positions where they will be listened to, where they're given authority and given a voice, and then kind of revealing themselves as neurodivergent and being able to speak. So I think in terms of there have always been neurodivergent people speaking, and not just speaking with words, but acting and being in all of our lives, but to be naming that and to be having words for that and to be reducing the shame around that and to be able to recognize that and to connect with each other and to be able to amplify each other's voices and perspectives, I think is a wonderful thing.
You know, a massive part of the Asian culture is because we still have, in a majority, particularly in the Muslim context, arranged marriages. So if you are open, the idea is if you say, oh yeah, my daughter has ADHD, or if there's full disclosure, then there's this idea that they won't be able to get married, they won't get proposals, they won't get life partners. So there are so many elements that your elders and your parents think they're protecting you. So for example, in a family where you have four daughters and one is diagnosed with severe depression, if they come out with that, if it becomes known, then matchmakers and people will say, oh, maybe it's in the family. Like, for example, even if one sister can't have a child, then it will. There's a lot of a lack of education and closed-mindedness. Still, there's a lot of openness and education, and that doesn't come from religion. I don't think it comes from culture, and these are the taboos that have to be broken.
For that impulsive fear. Tony, do you have any thoughts on this?
I mean, again, I think our potential as a species, as individuals within social groups and communities, is realized when we feel psychologically safe where we are, and it's the energy that we have to achieve our potential is greater because we don't then waste so much energy in a state of fear and anxiety about things that we think are unpredictable, that people will potentially do us harm, even when that harm is done in ignorance rather than with intention. And I think Sophia's point really about enculturation is really important. And maybe that's a generational thing, that we can accept that there are many different cultures within our own country and within different countries internationally across the world, but that they must be rooted in a fundamental kind of acceptance and respect for our common humanity. I think only then is our amazing genius minds are ever going to really truly realize their potential. Maybe that's a bit idealistic, but there you go.
I don't think there are moments in time where you actually recognize this. And I think Charlotte, in the trauma conference last year, when I went, I was very disaffected with humanity. I had lost hope, and in so many ways, I was very tired of because I didn't want to switch off my social media. I didn't want to not see what was going on in the world, but I was exhausted. And then we went to this 5-day conference, and I was reinvigorated, and there were people from every culture, religion, color, background, you name it. But there was this homogenous love and understanding that was there, that actually was so healing, that the person I was on the 5th day wasn't the person who had entered on the 1st.
Yeah, there was a lot of really good stuff going around, but there was also something that I experienced, which is very difficult for me, which was when one of the speakers said to 140 people, autism is a trendy diagnosis for trauma.
There were moments in the whole of the 5 days where there were moments where, but you know what the comforting thing about that, and other moments where people said things that were not, to me acceptable, was that I was in a place where there were others who agreed with me. So there were voices of dissension, and you could find it was by the second day, we kind of started finding the people who were more
Yeah.
likely to agree with us, and our little
I know.
packs of people.
But I had to
Is
literally
also
go around and
human.
say, did they really say that? Was that because anyway? But that's the reason for having this open conversation around neurodiversity and trauma, because some people literally believe neurodiversity doesn't exist. It's everything is trauma. And we need to try to respectfully disagree, but also they need to understand that they can actually traumatize people by saying that. If you identify as autistic, as ADHD, and then someone tells you that doesn't exist, that's there should be an understanding with people with long lived experience as trauma experts that saying that is in itself traumatizing. And I liked that to come out.
One
I
of
mean,
my
sometimes
oh,
the
sorry,
most
Sylvia.
no, sorry,
Go ahead.
on
Go
you
ahead.
go. No, I was just going to say, sometimes you witness the most educated people saying the most ignorant things.
Yes.
So it's a state of mind
Yeah,
as
sure.
well. You don't have to have a doctoral degree. That doesn't mean that you're going to be always spouting enlightened
Yeah,
views.
absolutely.
If that were the case, wouldn't life and the world be a better place?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Emma.
I was just, one of the things I've noticed is that going into neurodivergent spaces, neurodivergent community of various kinds, is that a lot of the time, because these are the people who have one or multiple marginalizations in the wider world, a lot of the time when we go into these kind of spaces, these are the most inclusive and accepting spaces that I'm in. But sometimes these spaces just replicate the structures in the outside world. So this becomes a community of people who then replicate marginalizations within that group. And we think of like traumatized people kind of slipping into patterns of kind of jostling for power and position. And I think both of those things can happen, that people can be acutely aware when you're sort of regulated and all your kind of systems are online. You can be acutely aware of kind of not wanting anyone to go through what you've been through, but you can also have kind of burned into you the patterns of, well, who's in charge here? Who's the winner in this kind of intrinsic kind of fight or flight mode that it's very easy for people to go into.
Thank you. I was very interested in what you said, Sophia. You brought so much to the table here of thinking. That's great. Decolonizing diagnostics. I like that. Like, is that something we need to, on a regional basis, really start advocating for?
100%. The approaches, the language. But the thing is, we can only do that if we go into these communities. If we become familiar where we attach ourselves to their humanity, where we understand when we're saying that they're not. This is what pluralism is about. Where we're saying, where we're trying to understand, the language, and it's almost like, I've worked in a school where a teacher said that, well, we all know that black boys will end up in jail.
Yeah.
So what is that? How do you unravel that? These things are said and they're still being said. So it's about the thing is that you can only blaze your own trail. You can do what you can do and have an impact on the people around you the best that you can. But I mean, there has to, I have learned that there has to be, you can't change everything and everyone. So it's about managing your own expectations and emotions, but having the right intentions. But yeah, that language, those attitudes, those if you're in in economically developing countries and you are neurodivergent, then if you are diagnosed, well, you won't be diagnosed. Diagnosis is really difficult. Well, you have it in all aspects of healthcare, actually. So even in the UK and America, black women are more likely to die during childbirth than their white counterparts. So there are statistics on it. So what is that? Is all an impact of colonialism, or it's an impact of privilege. Really, colonialism is about one group having privilege over another. and then exerting that power by, you know, by violence, and then, you know, thinking, you know, even in you know, that film about 30-40 years ago, White Men Can't Jump. You know, even that idea, that isn't very long, it's not that so long ago, the idea that, you know, if you're black, you're going to be more athletic.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And
it's those, and they seep into health. They seep into health. They seep into healthcare. And if you think, yeah, if you think that this is, we've heard these things in our lifetimes, but a consultant or a psychiatrist or a diagnostician that we see, if they're 70 years old, they've been practicing for 40 years. 40 years ago, the language we used, our understanding. So it really is with communities understanding their trauma, their history, their past, and coming to them to help them. You're not trying to, it's not imposing a system upon them, an understanding upon them. It's meeting them with their stories and their experiences.
My children are half African, so I'm very keenly looking into everything, because it's very hard to be a young black man and autistic, for example. So it's very, very clear that there's different rules for different people. And we seem to live it all in my family one way or the other. So it's, Tony, do you have any thoughts on this?
I mean, it's the reality, it's the intersectionality, isn't it? You're going to find neurodivergence in every community, in every race, faith, culture. And I think it's important that we don't create ghettos of oppression. And, you know, I've seen this sometimes where we can almost, I've seen groups of people almost thrive on a victim narrative, that they are bonding through a sense of being oppressed or victimized. And while I understand that, there's also a bit of me that wants to caution against it, because if that becomes our narrative, then it becomes self-defeating. We just perpetuate the oppression and the isolation, and the, you know, and the deficit-based narrative, as opposed to engaging in conversations with people who are not of like mind, who don't think like us, because that is exactly how it is meant to be. And it's only through that I think we'll ever come to a point where we understand and accept that there's a good reason why we don't all think the same way, and that's different from values and morality. But I think it's important that we don't think that. I know there needs to be safe places. I remember as part of the gay community, there were places where LGBTQ people went where you felt safe, because it wasn't a very safe world. We're now at a point, at least in the UK, where the number of those kind of LGBTQ venues is diminished, because
it's more
we're not,
accepted.
when we don't isolate ourselves in order to feel safe. We can go anywhere now and feel safe, whatever bar or club or restaurant it might be. And I think I'd like to get to that point, where, regardless of the colours of your mind, that you know, and that we're engaging with other people all the time, and accept that you need to have different perspectives around the table, in every way, because it would be a very, very dull world if we were all the same. I think it's important that we have different perspectives. However much we like to find our tribe, we should always be outward facing.
Differences are the opportunities to learn. We have a very large North Star at the Institute, which is a world of no labels, where we all live harmoniously together. It might not happen in my lifetime, but if we build some of the bricks and the structure to make it happen later for the generations coming after us, then that would be enough for me. Anything else any one of you would like to share with our listeners?
No, I just think it's just a perseverance of understanding, and also, you know, just to touch on that idea of putting yourself as a victim. I don't think with many, I don't think it's a matter of victimizing yourself or putting yourself in that clique, but it's just understanding history, understanding the trauma, understanding generationally. So I feel that I have a good grasp of my history, my genealogy, where I've come from, the things and the trauma that's happened. But it doesn't mean that I agree with it or I'm accepting of it. And I'm certainly not a victim. So, and I think one of the worst things that I think you could say, I actually, a fellow student said this to me many years ago, that Black people just need to get over it. Why have they got such a chip on their shoulder? And that was when generational trauma wasn't a thing. But however, I remember going back to my mum, I think I was 15, and I said, you know, Mum, she said, this girl said this, and what should I have said to her as a reply? You know, because she said collectively there's certain behaviors that you just need to get over it. And my mum said then, and this is why I always thought she was a trailblazer, ahead of her time. She said, you know, the history of slavery, the history of Africa, how the Caribbean came about, colonialism, you carry that on your shoulders, you do. And maybe it's a chip or maybe it's a brick, but you have internalized that, and you behave in a way where you're trying to protect yourself. So where it's a defensive mechanism. So where you see groups of people that you think are behaving in a certain way, it's almost self-defense. And it's just, again, I say, just, you know, the commonality of humanity is far more invigorating, is far more freeing than the differences between us. And I think we can find them. But it's like you said, Tony, you're going into places where you're not comfortable, opening that dialogue.
Your discomfort and sit in it. Yeah. Thank you so much, all of you, for being here and for bringing your voices and all your experience and knowledge. Really, really appreciate that. Our hundreds of listeners appreciate it as well, and all the people who will see the videos after of everything. So that will live on for a long time. Thank you so much. And thank you so much to all our participants for taking part and for putting your thoughts and your questions into our Q&As. And have a wonderful weekend, all of you. Thank you.